The Midnight Shrine Keeper. My name is Kenji, and I'm a third-year economics student at Waseda University. What I'm about to tell you happened during the spring semester of 2023, when I took a night security job at Hachiman Shrine in Shibuya Ward. The job posting was almost too good to be true. 12,000 yen for 8 hours of work, 5 nights a week, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. All I had to do was walk the grounds once every hour and make sure no one was sleeping rough in the courtyards. Yamamoto-san, the head priest who hired me, was a soft-spoken man in his 60s. During my training, he walked me through the shrine grounds. "Nothing complicated," he said, handing me a flashlight and keys. "Just check the gates during your rounds." "Has there ever been any trouble?" I asked. Yamamoto-san paused, looking toward the main hall. "No trouble with the living," he said quietly. "Just be respectful. This is sacred ground." My first week went smoothly. The shrine at night was peaceful, almost meditative. I'd do my hourly rounds, then sit in the security office studying for exams. The steady income meant I could finally afford proper textbooks. It was on my 9th night that I first heard the sweeping. I was working through economics problems when I heard the distinctive sound of a bamboo broom against stone. Scritch, 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 rhythmic sweeping coming from the main courtyard. I checked my watch. 2:47 a.m. That was odd. Yamamoto-san had been clear that I was the only person who should be on the grounds after closing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. "Sumimasen, is someone there?" The sweeping stopped immediately. I swept my flashlight across the courtyard, but everything looked normal. Yet something felt different. The air seemed heavier, somehow, charged with energy I couldn't name. The next night, I was ready. I positioned myself at the security office window at 2:45 a.m., watching. 2:47 arrived with mechanical precision. Scritch, scritch, scritch. This time, I could see him. In the pale moonlight, an elderly man in traditional white and red priest robes moved with slow, careful motions, sweeping the stones around the Purification fountain. My heart hammered. This wasn't Yamamoto-san. This figure was older, smaller, moving in ritualistic patterns as if he'd done this thousands of times. I stepped into the courtyard. "Excuse me, can I help you?" He didn't respond, just kept sweeping in a slow circle around the fountain. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. His feet weren't quite touching the ground, and where his sandals should have left impressions on the damp stones, there was nothing. When he finished sweeping, he bowed toward the main hall, turned, and walked directly toward me. As he passed within arm's reach, I caught a glimpse of his face, kind but distant eyes, waxy translucent skin, and a scent like incense and smoke and charred wood. He climbed the steps to the main hall, bowed deeply, and simply faded like morning mist. I stood alone, shaking, staring at the spot where he'd vanished. The bamboo broom lay propped against the fountain, bone dry despite the evening rain. The stones around the fountain, which had been wet, were now completely clean and dry in a perfect circle. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, when Yamamoto-san arrived, he took one look at my face and sighed deeply. "You saw him, didn't you?" I nodded. Yamamoto-san gestured for me to follow him to his office. He made tea with careful motions, his hands shaking slightly. "His name was Takeshi-san," he said finally. "He was the head priest here for over 30 years. He died in a fire in 1983, March 15th, around 3 in the morning. An electrical fault started a blaze that destroyed the main hall and 2 smaller buildings." My mouth felt dry. "And Takeshi-san?" "They found him in the main hall, near the altar. He must have been trying to save the sacred objects when the roof collapsed." Yamamoto-san poured tea steadily. "He died doing what he'd done every day, taking care of this place. But the main hall isn't burned. We rebuilt it in 1985. architecturally identical to the original, on the exact same foundation. So he's still here? Every night at 2:47 a.m. That was when he always finished his evening cleaning routine. Yamamoto-san sipped his tea. He's never harmful. He just continues his duties. Why didn't you warn me? His smile was apologetic. Would you have taken the job? Besides, not everyone can see him. Spiritual sensitivity varies. I needed the money, so I kept working. After that first encounter, seeing Takeshi-san became routine. Every night at 2:47, he'd appear with his broom, sweep the courtyard in the same pattern, bow to the main hall, and fade away. The other shrine workers accepted my situation with matter-of-fact Japanese pragmatism. Sato-san gave me a protective omamori charm. Yoshida-san advised me not to interrupt his routine. Even my parents reacted practically. As long as he's not bothering you and you're being paid, my mother said, just be respectful. Weeks passed. I grew used to sharing my workplace with Takeshi-san's spirit, scheduling my rounds to avoid his cleaning time. But as spring semester ended, something changed. Small things at first. My flashlight moved from where I'd left it. Locked doors stood ajar. The bamboo broom appeared in different locations, as if someone wanted me to notice. Then came my last night at the shrine, June 20th. I'd found a better job and given notice. 2:47 a.m. came and went. No sweeping sounds. No elderly priest. Just silence. Concerned, I walked to the courtyard. The bamboo broom was there, but it looked weathered, as if decades of use had caught up with it. Young man. I turned and saw Takeshi-san near the main hall steps, but this time was different. He was looking directly at me with sharp, aware eyes. Yes? Takeshi-san? You're leaving. He smiled, fully present for the first time. You've been a good companion, respectful, patient. Thank you, sir. I have a favor to ask. Would you help me with something? Against my better judgment, I nodded. There's something in the main hall, something I was trying to save the night I died. Perhaps someone living could help. I followed him up the steps. The locked doors swung open at his approach. Inside, he walked to a spot near the altar that seemed ordinary to me. Here, he said, pointing to the wooden floor. During the fire, I hid the shrine's most precious artifact beneath these boards. I found the loose floorboard and lifted it. Underneath, wrapped in silk cloth, was a small package. The original charter from the Meiji Emperor establishing this shrine. Takeshi-san said softly, signed in his own hand, irreplaceable. I lifted the package carefully. The silk was intact, protected by the tight fit of the floorboard. Yamamoto-san should have this, I said. Yes, it belongs with the living, not hidden with the dead. As I stood holding the charter, Takeshi-san looked different, less substantial, as if completing this task had loosened whatever bound him here. Thank you, he said. I can rest now. Will I see you again? He smiled that kind, distant smile. Perhaps, but not here. Not like this. He bowed deeply and faded away. The next morning, I presented the charter to Yamamoto-san. His eyes filled with tears as he unwrapped it. We've been looking for this since the fire, he whispered. We thought it was lost forever. He arranged for proper preservation and paid me a bonus that covered my summer expenses. I never saw Takeshi-san again, but sometimes, walking past other shrines, I catch the scent of incense and smoke, and something else, the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. I've graduated now, gotten a job at a securities firm, but I still visit Hachiman Shrine sometimes. The charter is displayed in a place of honor, though the plaque doesn't mention Takeshi-san's 40-year vigil. Some stories are too strange for official histories, but I know, and now you know too. Sometimes the dead have work left to do, and sometimes, if we're patient and respectful, we can help them finish it. The Offering Box Secret. My name is Yuki, and I became a Miko at Benzaiten Temple in Ueno when I was 22 years old. This was back in 2024, during one of the most difficult periods of my life. I'd just graduated from university with a degree in literature, but the job market was terrible, and my parents were pressuring me to find stable work quickly. The position at Benzaiten Temple wasn't exactly what I'd planned for my career, but it offered room and board plus a modest salary. More importantly, it felt like a chance to find some spiritual direction after years of academic stress and family expectations. Nakamura-san, the head priest, was a gentle man in his 70s who'd served the temple for over 40 years. During my first week, he taught me the daily routines with patient kindness. The most important duty, he explained as we stood before the main offering box, is maintaining the connection between the faithful and Benzaiten Sama. Every offering, no matter how small, represents someone's sincere prayer. The offering box was a beautiful wooden structure, darkened by decades of incense, smoke, and touched by countless hands. 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening, I was responsible for collecting the donations and recording them in the temple ledger. Count everything carefully, Nakamura-san instructed, not just for the temple's financial records, but to honor each person's devotion. Sometimes people give their last few coins hoping for blessings. The work was peaceful at first. Most offerings were exactly what you'd expect. 5 yen coins for good luck, 10 yen pieces from students praying for exam success, occasional 1,000 yen notes from visitors seeking more significant blessings. I'd sort the coins by denomination, note the amounts in the ledger, and store the money in the temple's safe. But it was during my 3rd week that I found the first tooth. I was doing the evening collection, tired after a long day of helping with temple maintenance and assisting visitors. As I poured the offering box contents onto the sorting tray, something small and white rolled across the wooden surface. At first, I thought it was a button or perhaps a small piece of ceramic from a broken charm. But when I picked it up, I realized with a chill that it was a child's tooth, a baby tooth, still small and perfect, with the root intact. My hands trembled as I held it. Who would leave a child's tooth in an offering box? And why? I brought it to Nakamura-san immediately. He was in his study, working on calligraphy for the upcoming autumn festival. "Excuse me, Nakamura-san," I said, bowing politely. I found something unusual in the offering box. When I showed him the tooth, his expression grew serious. He set down his brush and examined it carefully. "Ah," he said quietly, "it's starting again." "Starting again? Tell me, Yuki-san, have you been having any strange dreams since you began working here?" The question caught me off guard. I had been having unusual dreams, vivid, unsettling ones, where I found myself walking through the temple grounds in the middle of the night, drawn toward voices I couldn't quite understand. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I thought it was just from adjusting to the new environment." Nakamura-san nodded thoughtfully. "You have spiritual sensitivity. It's not uncommon for Miko, especially young women, but it means you'll be more affected by what's coming." "What's coming?" "The desperate ones," he said softly. "They come in cycles, usually every few years. Spirits who died carrying terrible guilt or shame. They're drawn to temples, especially to the offering boxes, hoping their gifts will somehow earn them forgiveness." He carefully wrapped the tooth in a piece of silk cloth. "But their offerings aren't meant for the living. They're confessions, attempts to unburden themselves of what they did in life." "What should I do if I find more?" "Never touch them directly with your bare hands. Never read any written messages aloud, and always bring them to me immediately." His eyes were kind but worried. "And Yuki-san? Be very careful about staying in the temple alone after dark." Over the following weeks, the strange offerings increased in frequency. I found locks of hair tied with red thread, small pieces of clothing that looked decades old, and folded papers covered in desperate handwriting. Following Nakamura-san's instructions, I used tweezers to handle everything, and brought each item to him without examining them closely. But it was impossible not to notice certain details. The handwriting on the papers was often shaky, as if written by someone in great distress. Some papers were stained with what looked like tears, and occasionally I glimpsed fragments of text phrases like, "I'm sorry and I didn't mean to," written over and over in obsessive repetition. The dreams intensified. Every night, I found myself walking through the temple grounds in my sleep, drawn toward the offering box by voices that whispered my name. I'd wake up exhausted, often finding dirt on my feet and the lingering scent of incense in my hair. Nakamura-san began leaving protective omamori charms around my living quarters and taught me purification rituals to perform each morning and evening. But the spiritual pressure continued building. "They're getting stronger," he explained during one of our evening discussions. "The more offerings they leave, the more connected they become to this place. And because you're the one handling their gifts, they're forming a link with you specifically. Is there anything we can do to stop it? We can contain it, but not eliminate it entirely. These spirits are bound by their own guilt. They can't move on until they feel their confessions have been properly received." He sighed heavily. "The problem is, receiving their confessions puts a spiritual burden on the living person who acknowledges them." As autumn deepened into winter, the offerings became more disturbing. I found children's drawings depicting terrible scenes, small toys broken in violent ways, and photographs so old they were brown with age. One morning, I discovered a complete set of baby teeth, arranged in a perfect circle around a folded confession. The written messages were the worst part. Even though I tried not to read them, sometimes I caught glimpses of the content: confessions of child abuse, abandonment, neglect, stories of desperate parents who'd made terrible choices during times of poverty and war. One paper, stained with what might have been blood, contained just 3 words, repeated hundreds of times: "I loved him, I loved him, I loved him." I stopped eating properly. Sleep became impossible without nightmares. During temple duties, I found myself trembling when approaching the offering box, dreading what I might find. The breaking point came on a frigid December night, when I found myself sleepwalking again, but this time I was aware of it. I watched helplessly as my body moved through the temple grounds without my conscious control, drawn by voices that seemed to come from the offering box itself. Standing before the wooden box in my nightgown, I felt compelled to reach inside. My hand, moving independently of my will, pulled out a folded paper that hadn't been there during the evening collection. As my fingers touched the paper, images flooded my mind: a desperate mother during the war years, a sickly baby who wouldn't stop crying, neighbors who threatened to report them for disturbing the peace. The mother's growing desperation as food ran out and the baby's cries grew weaker. And then the terrible moment when exhaustion and despair drove her to. I woke up screaming in my futon, the paper clutched in my hand. Nakamura-san found me there at dawn, still holding the confession and shaking uncontrollably. Without a word, he helped me to the main hall where he began an immediate purification ritual. "The connection has become too strong," he said as he lit incense and arranged protective talismans around me. "They're trying to share their burden with you directly, but a living person can't carry that much spiritual weight. What happens if they succeed? The guilt they carry could consume you. You might find yourself compelled to confess sins that aren't your own, or worse, to act out their final desperate moments." The purification ritual helped, but both of us knew it was a temporary solution. The spirits had established a connection through the offerings, and breaking it completely would require more drastic measures. "I have a proposal," Nakamura-san said, after we'd secured additional protective barriers around the temple, "but it will change how we handle the offerings permanently." His solution was practical but sorrowful. We would install a second inner offering box with a special blessing that would contain the spiritual energy of desperate offerings. My job would change. Instead of directly handling the contents, I would use long-handled tools to transfer everything to the inner box. where the items would remain until they could be properly disposed of through spiritual cleansing. It's not a perfect solution, he admitted. The spirits will still come, still leave their confessions, but the connection between them and the living world will be filtered through proper spiritual barriers. We implemented the new system before New Year's Day of 2025. The desperate offerings continued, but I no longer had direct contact with them. The sleepwalking stopped, though I still sometimes heard whispered voices near the offering box late at night. Nakamura-san explained that we were essentially creating a spiritual postal system, a way for the desperate dead to deliver their confessions without overwhelming the living recipients. It's not about granting them forgiveness, he said. That's beyond our power. But we can acknowledge their regret, which sometimes provides enough relief for them to find peace. 6 months have passed since we changed the system. The desperate offerings still appear regularly: teeth, hair, photographs, and endless written confessions. But now they accumulate in the inner box, contained by spiritual barriers and processed through monthly purification ceremonies. Sometimes I wonder about the stories behind each offering. The mother who gave her child's teeth, hoping to somehow undo the moment she let desperation override love. The father who left locks of his daughter's hair, carrying guilt over choices made during impossible circumstances. I've learned that some forms of spiritual work require accepting burdens without fully understanding them. The desperate dead don't need our judgment or solutions. They need acknowledgement that their pain existed, that their regret is real. I'm still a Miko at Benzaiten Temple. The work has changed me, made me more aware of the thin boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of unfinished sorrows. But I've also learned that traditional spiritual practices exist for good reasons. They provide structure for dealing with forces beyond ordinary human experience. Every morning, I perform purification rituals before approaching the offering boxes. Every evening, I place protective talismans and express gratitude for the barriers that keep desperate spirits from overwhelming the living. And late at night, when I hear whispered voices near the offering box, I don't try to understand the words. Some confessions are too heavy for the living to carry, but that doesn't mean they should go unheard. The desperate dead deserve acknowledgement, even if we can't provide absolution. Sometimes, being witnessed in their regret is enough to lighten the spiritual burden that binds them to places like temples, where forgiveness and judgment intersect with human hope. That's the secret I've learned about offerings. They're not always gifts. Sometimes they're confessions, and sometimes the most sacred duty is simply being willing to receive them. The Temple School Apartment. My name is Hiroshi Tanaka, and I teach 4th grade at Sakura Elementary in Adachi Ward. What I'm about to tell you happened in 2023, when I was 25 and struggling to make ends meet on a new teacher's salary. Finding affordable housing in Tokyo is nearly impossible for young professionals, especially teachers. After months of searching, I found a one-room apartment for 58,000 yen per month. The real estate agent, Suzuki-san, seemed eager to close the deal quickly. "It's a great location," he said, walking me through the tiny apartment. Very quiet neighborhood, close to the train station. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, with a single window overlooking an abandoned temple complex, old buildings with weathered rooflines and overgrown gardens. "What's the story with the temple?" I asked. "Jizo Temple. Been closed for years," Suzuki-san said briefly. I signed the lease that afternoon and moved in with basic furniture, futon, desk, and television. The first few weeks were peaceful. I established a routine: wake up early, prepare lessons over coffee, catch the train to school, return home around 7 p.m. to grade papers, and plan for the next day. During my 3rd week, I first heard the children. I was grading worksheets when young voices began reciting Buddhist sutras in unison. The sound came from the direction of the temple, muffled but distinct. "Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu." They chanted in perfect rhythm. Looking out my window, I saw a faint, warm glow in the temple's main hall, as if candles were lit inside. The chanting continued for exactly 30 minutes before fading into silence. The next evening, it happened again. Same time, 8 p.m., same voices reciting the same sutras. I counted at least 12 different children chanting together with practiced precision. When I watched the temple closely, I could see small silhouettes sitting in formal rows inside the main hall, their heads bowed in concentration. This pattern continued for weeks. The children's voices for exactly 30 minutes, warm light glowing in the hall, small figures visible through the windows. But something felt wrong. During the day, the temple looked completely abandoned. No signs of maintenance, weeds growing through courtyard cracks, missing roof tiles. I walked around the temple complex one morning before work. The main gate was chained shut with a rusty padlock that clearly hadn't been opened in years. Yet that evening, the chanting resumed right on schedule. But I never saw anyone enter or leave the temple grounds. The children never moved or took breaks. They sat in perfect stillness, voices never wavering in rhythm or volume. More disturbing, the voices were becoming clearer each night, as if whatever barrier separated their world from mine was gradually thinning. I could distinguish individual children now, a girl with a slight lisp who struggled with certain syllables, a boy whose voice was beginning to change, younger children who occasionally fell behind the rhythm before catching up. As weeks passed, I found myself learning their personalities through their recitation styles. There was one girl whose voice was always perfectly clear and confident, a boy who rushed through familiar parts but slowed during difficult passages, a small child whose voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear her contributions. I asked my elderly neighbor, Yamada-san, about the temple during one of our hallway conversations. "Ah, such a tragedy," she said sadly. "The fire, maybe 15 years ago, back when the temple held Buddhist school for local children every evening after regular school." My stomach felt cold. What happened? Electrical fire in the main hall during evening lessons. Winter night, very dry conditions. The old wooden buildings went up so fast. She shook her head sadly. 12 children and their priest all died from smoke inhalation before the fire department could reach them. I felt dizzy. 12 children? Such young voices, silenced forever. The families were devastated. The temple never reopened after that. Too much sadness, too many memories. That evening, I listened to the chanting with new understanding. 12 voices, just as Yamada-san had said. The same sutras they'd been learning when the fire took their lives, practiced with eternal devotion in the ruins of their classroom. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt overwhelmingly sad. These children, trapped in their final lesson, continuing their studies in death because they'd never had the chance to complete them in life. I visited the ward office and requested records about the fire. The details were heartbreaking. The fire had started around 8 p.m., exactly when I heard the chanting. The children had been practicing for their winter festival when faulty wiring sparked a blaze that spread through the wooden buildings. Investigators found all 13 victims arranged in formal sitting positions, as if they'd maintained their lesson formation even as smoke overcame them. Witnesses reported hearing the children continuing to recite sutras even as smoke poured from the building. Understanding why their spirits continued the evening practice didn't make the situation less disturbing. As winter progressed, I began hearing the chanting at random times. Sometimes I'd wake to find my breath visible in cold air, as if smoke was seeping through my walls. More disturbing, I started hearing other sounds mixed with the chanting, chairs scraping against wooden floors. And sometimes, very faintly, coughing as if smoke was still affecting their ability to recite clearly. One evening in December, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Between the familiar sutras, I heard a child's voice call out in distress. "Sensei, I can't see. There's too much smoke." The chanting faltered for just a moment, before resuming, but I could hear fear creeping into the young voices, the terror of children who realized something was terribly wrong. Another voice, higher and panicked. "Where's the door? I can't find the door." The crisis came in late January, during a particularly cold snap that reminded me unpleasantly of the winter night when the fire occurred. I was grading tests at my desk when the evening chanting began earlier than usual, 7:30 instead of 8 p.m., but this time something was fundamentally different. The voices sounded closer, clearer, as if the children were no longer confined to the temple ruins. Looking out my window, I saw that the temple hall was completely dark. No warm glow, no flickering candlelight. But the chanting continued, seeming to come from directly inside my apartment. "Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu." The young voices recited, but now I could hear individual words distinctly, as if each child was sitting next to me at my desk. That's when I noticed the smell smoke, faint but unmistakable, curling through my room, despite all windows being closed and no sources of fire anywhere in the building. Panic rising, I realized what was happening. The anniversary of the fire was approaching, and the children's spirits were growing stronger, trying to complete their interrupted lesson by including me in their eternal classroom. I grabbed my phone and called the only person I could think of who might understand the Buddhist temple near my school, where I sometimes took students for cultural education visits. The priest who answered, "Watanabe-san," listened to my stumbling explanation with patient gravity. "Can you come here immediately?" he asked. "Bring something personal, something that connects you to your work as a teacher." I threw my lesson plan book and grading materials into a bag and took the next train across the city. Watanabe-san met me at the temple entrance, already prepared with purification materials and a solemn expression that told me he understood exactly what I was facing. "Spirits of children who died during learning are particularly persistent," he explained, as he began the cleansing ritual. "Their desire to complete interrupted education can draw living teachers into their spiritual classroom. If the connection becomes too strong, you could be pulled permanently into their eternal lesson." The purification ceremony was unlike anything I'd experienced. Watanabe-san chanted protective sutras while burning specific incense designed to cleanse spiritual contamination. He sprinkled blessed salt around me in intricate patterns and placed protective amulets at strategic points. But the most important part was when he asked me to formally complete the lesson the children had been practicing when they died. "They need closure," he explained. "A proper ending to their interrupted studies. You must act as their sensei and provide the conclusion their education never received." Standing in that temple at midnight, surrounded by flickering candles and the scent of purifying incense, I recited the same sutras I'd been hearing for months. But this time I spoke them as a teacher, addressing students, acknowledging their dedication, praising their effort, and formally concluding their lesson with the respect their devotion deserved. As I spoke the final words, I felt a shift in the air, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The purification helped, but Watanabe-san warned that the children's connection to education might persist in subtle ways. He gave me protective amulets and specific prayers to recite daily, but also offered practical advice. Honor their memory through your teaching. They died pursuing knowledge. Let that dedication inspire your work with living students. I returned to my apartment the next morning. The evening chanting had stopped, but sometimes I still catch faint echoes during quiet moments, not disturbing now, but like distant encouragement from students who understood the sacred nature of learning. I've stayed in that apartment for 2 years now. The temple remains abandoned, gradually deteriorating, but I've placed a small memorial on my windowsill, fresh flowers and incense that I refresh weekly, maintaining a connection that honors rather than disturbs. Sometimes, when I'm preparing particularly challenging lessons for my own students, I remember those 12 young voices practicing their sutras with such unwavering dedication. Their eternal devotion to learning reminds me why education matters. even in the face of tragedy. I've become a better teacher because of them, more patient with students who struggle, more appreciative of the precious time we have together in our classroom. Every lesson could be interrupted. Every student could be taken away. That awareness makes each day of teaching feel sacred. The children of Jizo Temple taught me that learning doesn't end with death, and that a teacher's responsibility extends beyond the living students in front of us. Sometimes we must help complete lessons that were left unfinished, honoring the devotion of students whose education was cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control. That's a lesson worth remembering, even when it comes from voices that speak across the boundary between life and death. The wedding photographer's last shot. My name is Mei Sato, and I've been a freelance wedding photographer in Tokyo for 6 years. What I'm about to tell you happened during the spring and summer of 2024, when my business was finally starting to thrive, after years of struggling to establish myself in the competitive wedding photography market. I specialize in traditional Shinto wedding ceremonies at Tokyo's historic shrines. It's a niche that took years to develop, but one that pays well. Couples who choose shrine weddings over hotel ceremonies tend to value authenticity and are willing to invest in quality photography that captures the sacred nature of their union. The work requires understanding both traditional ceremony protocols and the spiritual significance of each location. I've photographed weddings at over 30 different shrines across Tokyo, from the famous Meiji Shrine to smaller neighborhood temples that have been hosting ceremonies for centuries. Each location has its own character, its own way the light falls across the sacred spaces, its own challenges for capturing the perfect shot. My apartment in Shibuya is small but serves as both home and studio space where I edit photos and meet with clients. The rent is steep, but being centrally located means I can reach most Tokyo shrines within an hour, which is essential when dealing with strict ceremony schedules. Business had been particularly good that spring. Word-of-mouth referrals from satisfied couples meant I was booked almost every weekend, sometimes handling 2 ceremonies in a single day. The financial pressure that had dominated my 20s was finally easing, and I was even considering upgrading my camera equipment. It was during a ceremony at He Shrine in May that I first noticed something unusual in my photos. The wedding was for a young couple, Tanaka-san and his bride Yuko-san. It was a beautiful spring morning, perfect lighting conditions, and the ceremony proceeded flawlessly. The bride looked radiant in her white shiromuku kimono, the groom dignified in his formal hakama, and their families beamed with joy during the sacred sake-sharing ritual. When I returned home that evening to process the day's photos, everything looked perfect at first glance. But as I worked through the images in detail, adjusting light levels and checking for focus, I noticed something odd in several shots taken during the Sansan Kudo ceremony. Behind the happy couple, slightly out of focus but clearly visible, was what appeared to be another woman in wedding attire. She was pale, almost translucent, with long black hair partially covering her face. Her expression was difficult to read, not angry or frightening, but intensely sad, as if she was watching something she desperately longed for but could never have. My first thought was that it must be a double exposure or some kind of camera malfunction. But I'd been using the same equipment for years without any issues, and the figure appeared in multiple shots from different angles. More disturbing, when I examined the photos carefully, I realized the mysterious woman was always positioned to have a clear view of the bride and groom during their most intimate ceremonial moments. I spent hours that night going through every photo from the ceremony, but the pale woman appeared in only 5 shots, always during the most sacred parts of the ritual, the sake sharing, the ring exchange, and the final bows to the kami. Professional responsibility demanded that I deliver clean, perfect photos to my clients. I spent the next morning carefully editing out the mysterious figure, using techniques I'd learned for removing unwanted background elements. The work was painstaking, but I managed to create flawless images that captured only the joy and sanctity the couple deserved to remember. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. 2 weeks later, at a ceremony at Yasukuni Shrine, it happened again. This time I was prepared, watching carefully through my viewfinder during the ceremony, but I saw nothing unusual with my naked eye. The mysterious woman appeared only in the digital images, different clothing this time, what looked like a formal kimono from the early Showa period, but the same pale, sorrowful expression, the same positioning that suggested she was drawn to witness the couple's happiness. I began keeping detailed records. Each time the figure appeared, I noted the shrine location, the time of day, the specific parts of the ceremony where she manifested, and any historical research I could find about the venue. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. After 6 more ceremonies at different shrines, I had documented appearances at 8 locations across Tokyo. Each time, the mysterious woman wore clothing from different historical periods, sometimes Meiji-era formal dress, sometimes Taisho period wedding kimono, once what appeared to be wartime civilian clothes from the 1940s. But most unsettling was what I discovered when I researched the shrine's histories. At He Shrine, local records mentioned a young woman named Michiko who died of tuberculosis in 1938, just 3 days before her planned wedding ceremony. Her fiancé had died in the China incident 2 months earlier, but news of his death hadn't reached her family until after her own passing. Yasukuni Shrine's records were more extensive due to its military connections, but I found reference to numerous women who had died during wartime, some from illness, some in air raids, while waiting for fiancés who were fighting overseas. Many had planned post-war weddings that never occurred. Each shrine where the figure appeared had similar stories. Women who died before their wedding days, some from illness, some from accidents, some from the various tragedies that marked 20th century Japan. All had been preparing for marriages that were cut short by circumstances beyond their control. The realization hit me with sickening clarity. These weren't random hauntings. These were the spirits of women whose lives had been interrupted at the moment when they were closest to experiencing the joy and fulfillment of marriage. They were drawn back to witness what had been stolen from them, forever observing ceremonies they would never participate in. But understanding the phenomenon didn't make it easier to handle professionally. Each ceremony became an exercise in stress management as I waited to see which shots would be contaminated by supernatural intrusions. I started bringing backup cameras and shooting far more photos than necessary, knowing I'd need clean alternatives. The emotional toll was exhausting. These weren't malevolent spirits, they were profoundly sad presences, bound to sacred spaces by their unfulfilled longing for love and matrimonial happiness. I found myself feeling genuinely sorrowful for them, which made the editing process of removing them from couples' precious memories feel almost cruel. My work quality suffered as I became preoccupied with watching for supernatural manifestations instead of focusing purely on capturing the living subjects. I missed several perfect shots because I was checking my camera display for unwanted figures rather than timing the next frame. The crisis came during a ceremony at Kanda Shrine in July. The bride was a young office worker named Akiko-san, marrying her university sweetheart in what should have been a joyful celebration. But this time, the mysterious figure didn't just appear in my photos. I saw her directly through my camera viewfinder during the ceremony itself. She was standing directly behind the bride during the Sansan Kudo, reaching forward with pale hands as if trying to touch the sake cups, her mouth moving soundlessly, as if reciting prayers or vows she'd never been able to speak. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped my camera. The priest continued the ceremony, apparently unaware of the spiritual presence, but I could see tears streaming down the apparition's translucent cheeks as she watched Akiko-san receive the blessings she herself had been denied. When I processed those photos later, they showed not just one figure, but 3 different women, all in wedding attire from different eras, all positioning themselves to witness the sacred moments they'd never experienced in life. I realized I needed help. Through a friend who worked at NHK, I found contact information for Yamada-san, a Shinto priest who specialized in spiritual counseling for people dealing with supernatural encounters. He agreed to meet with me at a quiet coffee shop in Roppongi. Photography can be a spiritually sensitive activity, he explained after I'd shared my experiences. Cameras sometimes capture spiritual energy that the human eye filters out. You may have natural spiritual sensitivity that's being amplified by your work in sacred spaces. Why wedding ceremonies specifically? I asked. Marriage represents one of life's most fundamental transitions, the joining of two souls, the creation of new family bonds, the promise of future generations. For spirits who died before achieving this transition, wedding ceremonies represent everything they lost. The concentrated joy and hope create a spiritual beacon that draws them back. Yamada-san's solution was practical but sobering. He couldn't banish the spirits they were bound to the shrines by legitimate grief and hadn't chosen their fate. But he could provide me with protective practices to minimize my spiritual sensitivity during work. He taught me purification rituals to perform before each ceremony, gave me specific amulets to wear while shooting, and suggested I change my photographic approach to be more spiritually respectful, acknowledging the sacred nature of the spaces I worked in rather than treating them purely as scenic backdrops. You might also consider, he said gently, whether this work is appropriate for someone with your level of spiritual sensitivity. Some people are called to witness the supernatural, but that doesn't mean they should spend their careers surrounded by it. The protective measures helped reduce the frequency of supernatural appearances, but they didn't eliminate them entirely. I learned to work with the knowledge that some of my shots would require careful editing, and I developed techniques for quickly identifying and removing unwanted spiritual elements. More importantly, I changed how I understood my role. Instead of seeing the mysterious figures as problems to be solved or obstacles to perfect photography, I began to think of myself as documenting not just the joy of the living, but also the sorrow of the dead who were drawn to witness it. I started keeping the unedited photos, the ones containing the spiritual figures, in a separate archive, not to share with clients, but as a record of these women whose stories had been interrupted by tragedy. Sometimes I found myself studying their faces, wondering about their original wedding plans, the dresses they'd chosen, the futures they'd imagined. It's been 8 months since I implemented Yamada-san's protective practices. I still work shrine weddings, though I'm more selective about locations and timing. The mysterious figures still appear occasionally, but less frequently, and I've learned to handle their presence with respectful professionalism rather than panic. I've also expanded my services to include memorial photography, helping families document visits to graves and ancestral shrines. It feels like a more appropriate use of whatever spiritual sensitivity I possess, honoring the dead rather than simply editing them out of happy occasions. The women who appear in my wedding photos have taught me something important about the nature of love and loss. Their presence reminds me that every joyful ceremony takes place in spaces where countless other stories of love were cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The happiness of the living exists alongside the sorrow of the dead, and sometimes the most respectful thing we can do is acknowledge both. I still remove the spirits from my clients' wedding photos. They deserve images that capture only their joy, not the sadness of strangers. But I remember each woman I've witnessed, each pale face drawn to observe the ceremonies they never got to experience themselves. Sometimes love transcends death, but not always in ways that bring peace. Some spirits are bound not by anger or revenge, but by a longing so pure and desperate that even death cannot diminish it. They remain, forever watching, forever hoping to touch just once the happiness that was taken from them. That's something worth remembering, even when it complicates our work and challenges our understanding of where the living world ends and the realm of the dead begins. The purification ritual gone wrong. My name is Tanaka, and I've been the groundskeeper at Kiyomizu Temple for 23 years. What I'm about to tell you began in spring 2024, when I was 58 and thought I'd seen everything. I started working here after my construction company went bankrupt in the early 2000s. The temple job didn't pay much, but provided stability, housing on the grounds, and meaningful work after years building shopping centers. My routine has remained the same for decades. I arrive before dawn, around 5 a.m., to prepare the temple for visitors. The most important task is maintaining the purification fountain near the main gate, a stone basin fed by spring water, where worshippers cleanse their hands and mouths before entering sacred spaces. The fountain is over 400 years old, carved from granite and fed by an underground spring that never runs dry. Water emerges from a bamboo pipe, fills the basin, and overflows into drainage channels toward the temple gardens. Every morning, I clean the basin thoroughly, removing debris, scrubbing stone surfaces, and ensuring clear water flow. It's meditative work that I've always found spiritually satisfying. But starting in early April 2024, something changed. I arrived one morning to find the fountain filled with blood-red water, not rust-colored from mineral deposits, but deep crimson like fresh blood. I initially thought someone had vandalized the fountain overnight. I drained and scrubbed the basin thoroughly, checking the spring source for contamination. The underground flow ran crystal clear. Whatever colored the water affected only what accumulated overnight. After cleaning, I refilled the fountain and watched carefully throughout the day. It remained perfectly clear with its usual mineral sparkle. Visitors used it normally for purification rituals. But the next morning, the water was red again. This pattern continued for a week. Every morning, I'd find crimson water that looked like blood. Every day, I'd clean it thoroughly, and it would run clear until the next morning. I reported the problem to Yamamoto-san, the head priest, but he seemed reluctant to discuss it. "Just keep cleaning it," he said quietly. "Make sure it's pure before the temple opens. Visitors must never see it like that." His response troubled me. In 20 years working together, Yamamoto-san had always been forthright about maintenance issues. The situation became more disturbing during the second week. I started arriving earlier and discovered the water didn't gradually turn red overnight. At exactly 3:17 a.m., clear water would suddenly become crimson. The red water had a distinct smell, not metallic like blood, but organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. When I cleaned the basin each morning, I found small personal items: a child's wooden toy, tiny fabric pieces, once a small ceramic figure of Jizo. After 3 weeks, I decided to stay overnight and witness what happened at 3:17 a.m. I positioned myself in the garden near the fountain with a thermos of tea and a small flashlight, settling in to wait among the carefully maintained shrubs that provided cover while giving me a clear view of the purification basin. The night was quiet, with only the usual sounds of the city settling into late-night stillness beyond the temple walls. The fountain's water ran clear and peaceful under the moonlight, and I began to wonder if my presence might prevent whatever phenomenon had been occurring. 3:17 a.m. arrived with precision. The water in the basin began to darken from the bottom up, as if something was bleeding into it from the stone itself. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. As the water turned red, I saw a figure approaching the fountain, a woman in what appeared to be clothing from the 1970s, carrying something small in her arms. She moved with the desperate urgency of someone performing a task they'd done countless times before. Without acknowledging my presence, she knelt beside the basin and began what looked like a purification ritual, but conducted in reverse. Instead of cleansing herself with the sacred water, she seemed to be trying to cleanse something else by submerging it in the increasingly red liquid. I realized with horror that she was holding what appeared to be a small child, lifeless and pale, and she was lowering the tiny body into the fountain water while speaking in urgent, pleading whispers that I couldn't quite understand. The scene lasted perhaps 5 minutes before the woman and child faded like morning mist, leaving behind only the basin of red water and the lingering smell of decaying flowers. I sat in the garden until dawn, shaking and trying to process what I'd witnessed. When the temple grounds began stirring to life, I performed my usual cleaning routine mechanically, but my hands trembled as I scrubbed away the crimson water. That afternoon, I confronted Yamamoto-san directly. "I need to know what happened here," I said, describing what I'd seen. "That woman, that child, this isn't just a maintenance problem." Yamamoto-san's face grew grave. He led me to his private office and closed the door carefully before speaking. "Her name was Keiko Nakamura," he said quietly. "This happened in 1976, before I became head priest here, but the previous priest told me the story when I took over. She was a young mother, maybe 25 years old, with a sickly son who'd been ill for months with some kind of wasting disease." I settled into the chair across from his desk, sensing I was about to hear something that would change my understanding of the temple entirely. "The doctors couldn't help the boy," Yamamoto-san continued. "This was before modern pediatric medicine, and the family had limited financial resources. The child was dying slowly, painfully, and Keiko-san became desperate. What did she do? She'd heard stories about the healing power of sacred spring water, folk beliefs that weren't part of Orthodox Buddhist teaching, but popular among people who had nowhere else to turn. She began bringing the boy to the fountain at night, trying to bathe him in the holy water, hoping it would cure his illness." I felt my stomach tighten as I anticipated where this story was heading. But the boy continued to deteriorate, and on the night of April 15, 1976, Keiko-san made a terrible decision. She believed that if the sacred water couldn't heal him in life, perhaps it could purify his suffering by allowing him to die peacefully in holy water rather than slowly from disease. "She drowned him in the fountain?" Yamamoto-san nodded sadly. She held him under the water until he stopped breathing, believing she was ending his pain through sacred purification rather than letting him waste away from illness. Then she tried to drown herself as well, but temple security found her before she succeeded. "What happened to her?" "She was hospitalized, treated for her mental breakdown, and eventually released. But she never recovered from the guilt of what she'd done. She died by suicide 6 months later, unable to live with the knowledge that she'd killed her child while trying to save him. The weight of this tragedy settled over me like a physical burden. And she's still trying to purify him? Every night for nearly 50 years, Yamamoto-san confirmed. She returns to the fountain, eternally attempting the purification she believed would heal her son. But her guilt has contaminated the ritual. Instead of cleansing, her presence pollutes the sacred water with the blood of her regret. Why haven't you had the fountain blessed or cleansed by a spiritual practitioner? We've tried, many times over the decades. But Keiko-san's anguish isn't malevolent. It's maternal love, twisted into something tragic and obsessive. She genuinely believes she's performing a healing ritual, so protective barriers can't block her access to what she sees as sacred medical treatment. Yamamoto-san explained that the temple had consulted various spiritual practitioners over the years, from Buddhist monks to Shinto purification specialists. All had reached the same conclusion. Keiko-san's spirit was bound to the fountain by love rather than anger, making traditional exorcism approaches ineffective. The best we can do is maintain the purification function during daylight hours and ensure that visitors never encounter the contamination, he said. It's not a perfect solution, but it allows the temple to continue serving the living while acknowledging the suffering of the dead. Is this why you hired a groundskeeper specifically for early morning shifts? I asked, realizing for the first time that my work schedule had always been designed around this supernatural maintenance requirement. Yes, We've had groundskeepers handling this situation for decades. Most last a few years before the stress becomes too much and they find work elsewhere. You've stayed longer than most. Learning the truth about my work environment was both disturbing and oddly reassuring. The red water wasn't random supernatural harassment. It was the manifestation of a mother's eternal grief, and my daily cleaning ritual was part of a practical accommodation that allowed both the living and the dead to coexist in the same sacred space. But understanding the situation didn't make it less emotionally draining. Every morning brought the same crimson reminder of a tragedy that had occurred before I was born, and every cleaning session felt like participating in a cover-up of suffering that could never be properly addressed. The psychological toll accumulated over the following months. I began having nightmares about drowning children and desperate mothers. Sleep became difficult as 3:17 a.m. approached each night, even though I was in my apartment rather than watching the fountain directly. The knowledge that the tragedy was playing out in endless repetition just outside my window made rest nearly impossible. My work quality suffered as exhaustion set in. I made mistakes in garden maintenance and temple preparation that I'd never made before. Visitors occasionally commented on my distracted demeanor, and I worried that my condition was affecting the temple's reputation. In late autumn, I approached Yamamoto-san about finding a different solution. "I can't continue this indefinitely," I told him honestly. "The emotional burden is affecting my health and my ability to serve the temple properly." He listened with genuine compassion. "What would you like to try? Could we modify the approach? Instead of just cleaning away the evidence, could we acknowledge what's happening in some way that might provide comfort to her spirit?" After consulting with several spiritual advisors, Yamamoto-san agreed to implement a small memorial ritual. Each morning after cleaning the fountain, I would place a small offering of flowers and a brief prayer for both mother and child, acknowledging their suffering and expressing hope for their eventual peace. The memorial practice didn't stop the nightly contamination, but it changed the emotional dynamic of my morning routine. Instead of feeling like I was covering up a tragedy, I was honoring it while maintaining the fountain's function for living visitors. The red water still appeared every morning, but the accompanying objects, toys, fabric, ceramic figures became less frequent. More importantly, my own psychological burden lightened. I began sleeping better and approaching my work with renewed purpose. The situation remained supernatural and sorrowful, but it no longer felt like a secret shame that I carried alone. It's been 10 months since we implemented the memorial practice. Keiko, San's spirit, continues her nightly attempts at purification, and I continue my morning cleaning routine, but we've established a kind of respectful coexistence. She pursues her eternal quest for healing and forgiveness, and I maintain the fountain's sacred function for those who can still benefit from it. Sometimes, during particularly quiet mornings, I find myself speaking softly to her spirit while I work, acknowledging her dedication to her child and expressing hope that someday she'll find the peace that has eluded her for nearly 5 decades. The work has taught me that some spiritual problems can't be solved, only managed with compassion and patience. Keiko, San's guilt has contaminated the sacred waters, but her love, however, twisted by tragedy, remains genuine. My role isn't to banish her or cure her obsession, but to ensure that her eternal sorrow doesn't prevent others from accessing the purification and healing that sacred spaces can provide. That's a responsibility I can live with, even when it means starting every workday by cleaning blood-red water from a 400-year-old fountain, while honoring the memory of a mother whose love became her curse. The Festival Helper's Burden. My name is Akiko Yamada, and I work part-time at various festivals and cultural events around Tokyo to supplement my income from my day job at a convenience store. What I'm about to tell you happened during the summer of 2024, when I was 28 and struggling to make ends meet in an economy that seemed designed to keep young people perpetually broke. I'd been working festival jobs for 3 years, ever since my divorce left me, with apartment rent I couldn't afford on a single income. The work was irregular but decent pay, setting up decorations, helping with food booths, managing crowds during events. It wasn't glamorous, but it provided the extra 15 to 20,000 yen per month that made the difference between surviving and thriving. When I saw the posting for helpers during Obon Festival at Sengen Shrine in Asakusa, I applied immediately. Obon is one of the most important festivals in the Japanese calendar, 3 days when the spirits of the dead return to visit their families. The work involved setting up traditional paper lanterns, preparing ritual offerings, and helping families with their memorial ceremonies. The shrine coordinator, Matsumoto-san, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who explained my duties during our first meeting in early July. "Your main responsibility will be preparing the lanterns," she said, leading me through the shrine grounds. "We expect about 200 families this year, each needing lanterns to guide their ancestors' spirits home." The work was more complex than I'd anticipated. Each family required specific arrangements based on their ancestral needs, how many deceased relatives they were honoring, how long those relatives had been dead, what types of offerings were appropriate. Some families had elaborate multi-generational displays, while others lit single lanterns for recently departed loved ones. The most important thing, Matsumoto-san emphasized, is ensuring every spirit is properly welcomed. No one should be forgotten during Obon. I spent the week before the festival learning the traditional lantern arrangements and helping prepare hundreds of paper lanterns in various sizes and colors. The work was meditative, folding paper and attaching candles, while listening to Matsumoto-san explain the spiritual significance of each element. "Each lantern represents a soul," she told me. "When we light them, we're creating a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead." For 3 days, families can commune with ancestors who've passed beyond. The festival began on August 13th, with families arriving throughout the day to set up their memorial displays. I helped elderly grandparents carry heavy offerings, assisted young mothers in positioning lanterns correctly, and watched children learn the proper way to bow before ancestral altars. It was beautiful work, seeing families connect with their heritage and honor their deceased relatives with such reverence and love. By evening, the shrine grounds glowed with hundreds of flickering lanterns, each one representing someone's beloved ancestor welcomed back for the sacred reunion. But that first night, something unusual happened. I went home exhausted after the long day, fell asleep immediately, and woke the next morning feeling strangely tired, despite getting 8 hours of rest. My hands were dirty, with what looked like candle wax under my fingernails, and there was mud on my shoes that I couldn't explain. I assumed I'd forgotten to wash properly after the festival work, and thought nothing more of it. The second day of Obon brought even more families, and I spent another full day helping with lantern arrangements and memorial ceremonies. The shrine grounds were packed with visitors, and the evening lantern lighting ceremony was particularly moving as hundreds of families gathered to welcome their ancestors home. Again, I went to bed exhausted, and again I woke feeling unrefreshed, with waxy residue on my hands and dirt I couldn't remember acquiring. On the third morning, I decided to pay closer attention to my condition. The wax under my fingernails wasn't just residue from yesterday's work. It was fresh, as if I'd been handling lit candles recently. And the mud on my shoes wasn't random dirt, but the specific reddish clay that surrounded Sengen Shrine. More disturbing, I found a book of matches in my pocket that I didn't remember taking, and several were missing. That evening, after the final day of Obon celebrations, I prepared for bed, but set my phone to record video throughout the night. If something was happening during my sleep, I needed to understand what. The video revealed the truth that I'd been dreading. At 2:37 a.m., I got up from bed with my eyes closed, dressed quietly, and left my apartment. The phone's battery died after 3 hours, but it had captured enough to confirm my worst fears. I was sleepwalking, and was leaving my apartment in the middle of the night. The next morning brought the usual signs: waxy hands, muddy shoes, missing matches, and profound exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. But this time I also found something else: a small piece of paper in my pocket with names written in my own handwriting. Names I didn't recognize. Hiroshi Tanaka, died 1987, no family. Yuki Sato, died 1993, forgotten. Kenji Yamamoto, died 2001, alone. I stared at the paper with growing horror, realizing that somehow, during my sleepwalking episodes, I was collecting information about people I'd never heard of. That afternoon, I returned to Sengen Shrine to clean up after the festival, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening to me. The grounds looked different in daylight, emptier, sadder, with only a few families making final offerings before the ancestors returned to the spirit world. But I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Among the legitimate family lanterns, there were dozens of additional lanterns that hadn't been there during the official ceremonies. Small, simple lanterns placed in corners and shadowy areas, each with a single name written on paper and attached with string. The names matched the list I'd found in my pocket. I approached Matsumoto-san, who was supervising the cleanup, and showed her the paper with the mysterious names. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her expression growing serious. "I found it in my pocket this morning, but I don't remember writing it, and there are lanterns on the grounds with these same names." Matsumoto-san sighed deeply. "How have you been sleeping since the festival started?" "Badly. I keep waking up tired, with wax on my hands and mud on my shoes." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Come with me." She led me to a quiet area behind the main shrine building and gestured for me to sit on a wooden bench. "Every year during Obon, we have this problem," she began. "There are spirits who have no living relatives to honor them, people who died alone, families that died out, individuals whose deaths were never properly recognized. They're drawn to the festival, hoping someone will remember them, but they have no one to light lanterns on their behalf." I felt my stomach tightening. What does that have to do with me? Some people are spiritually sensitive to the needs of forgotten souls. During Obon, when the boundary between worlds is thin, these spirits can influence sensitive individuals to perform the memorial rites they can't arrange for themselves. "You're saying I'm sleepwalking to light lanterns for dead people?" "It's not uncommon. We've had several volunteers over the years who experienced similar episodes. The forgotten dead recognize someone who might help them, and they encourage that person to provide the memorial services they lack." She explained that my work preparing lanterns for families had created a spiritual connection to the festival's purpose, making me susceptible to influence from spirits who had no families of their own to perform the necessary rites. "Is it dangerous?" "Not directly harmful, but it can be exhausting. The spirits don't mean ill. They're just desperately lonely and hoping for acknowledgement. But carrying their burden can affect your health and well-being." Matsumoto-san offered practical solutions. She could arrange for a Shinto priest to perform purification rituals to reduce my spiritual sensitivity, or she could help me channel the episodes more safely by providing official recognition for the forgotten spirits. What would that involve? Instead of fighting the sleepwalking, we could establish a formal memorial service for unknown souls. Every year during Obon, the shrine would dedicate time to honoring those who have no families to remember them. You could participate consciously rather than being compelled unconsciously. The idea of helping forgotten spirits appealed to me more than trying to block them out entirely. These were people who had lived and died without anyone to mourn them. The thought of their eternal loneliness was heartbreaking. We established a new tradition at Sengen Shrine, the memorial service for forgotten souls. Each year during Obon, after the family ceremonies conclude, we hold a special evening for lighting lanterns for anyone who died without relatives to honor them. I help coordinate the event, and community members can participate by lighting lanterns for unknown spirits. The sleepwalking stopped once we formalized the memorial service, but my connection to forgotten souls remained. Throughout the year, I sometimes find myself aware of people who die alone: elderly neighbors, homeless individuals, isolated workers who pass away without anyone to notice. I keep a list, and during each Obon festival, we light lanterns for them. It's become meaningful work that goes beyond my original need for extra income. The memorial service for forgotten souls attracts people who understand the importance of ensuring no one dies completely unmemorial. We've created a community dedicated to honoring the memory of those society overlooks. The spiritual burden is lighter when it's shared consciously, rather than carried alone through supernatural compulsion. Working with forgotten spirits taught me that some supernatural experiences aren't malicious hauntings, but desperate requests for basic human dignity. The acknowledgement that someone existed, mattered, and deserves to be remembered. My festival work continues, but now it includes this special responsibility. Every summer during Obon, as families gather to honor their ancestors, we also gather to honor the ancestors who have no families left to remember them. It's a small act of collective compassion that ensures no spirit remains completely forgotten during the festival, when the dead return to seek connection with the living. The forgotten souls still influence me sometimes, but now it feels like collaboration rather than possession. They guide me toward people who need remembering, and I help ensure their names are included in our annual memorial service. It's a responsibility I've learned to carry with purpose rather than fear. Some supernatural encounters are calls to service rather than sources of terror. The spirits who disrupted my sleep weren't trying to harm me. They were asking for help with the most basic human need: to be remembered after death. Answering that call has given my part-time festival work deeper meaning than I ever expected when I first took the job to pay my rent. The Temple Daycare Incident. My name is Sato Michiko, and I've been a pediatric care worker for 15 years. What I'm about to tell you happened during the autumn and winter of 2024, when I was running a small home daycare from my apartment near Kompira Shrine in Sumida Ward. After working in institutional childcare for over a decade, I decided to start my own small daycare service. The bureaucratic restrictions and overcrowded conditions at larger facilities had left me feeling like I couldn't provide the individual attention children deserved. My apartment was small but adequate for caring for 6 children at a time, and being located near a quiet shrine meant the neighborhood was peaceful and safe. The licensing process was complex, but by September, I had official approval to operate a home daycare for children ages 3 to 5 whose parents worked irregular hours or needed flexible childcare arrangements. Most of my clients were single mothers, restaurant workers, and night shift employees who couldn't find suitable care elsewhere. My apartment was on the 2nd floor of an older building, with large windows overlooking the small courtyard of Kompira Shrine. The children loved watching the occasional visitors who came to pray, and I often took them to play in the shrine's peaceful gardens during good weather. It seemed like an ideal location for nurturing young minds. The children in my care were delightful. Kenji-kun, an energetic 4-year-old whose mother worked at a convenience store. Yuki-chan, a shy 3-year-old whose father was a taxi driver. Taro-kun and Hana-chan, siblings whose single mother worked double shifts at a restaurant. And little Emi-chan, whose grandmother brought her while managing her own small business. Everything proceeded normally for the first month. The children adapted well to the routine, played together harmoniously, and their parents were pleased with the individual attention I could provide. I felt confident that I'd made the right decision in starting my own childcare service. But in late October, I began noticing unusual behaviors during playtime. It started with Kenji-kun, who began talking to someone during his solo play sessions. This wasn't unusual. Many children have imaginary friends at that age, but his conversation seemed oddly structured, as if he was receiving specific instructions. "No, not like that," he would say to empty air while building with blocks. "The older children showed me the proper way. We must stack them like this." When I asked who had shown him, he would point to vacant areas of the room and say, "The friends who live near the shrine, they know the old games." I assumed he was referring to children he'd observed playing in the shrine courtyard, though I'd never seen other young children there during our visits. The shrine was typically visited by elderly locals and occasional tourists, not families with small children. Within a week, all the children in my care had begun interacting with these invisible friends. They would form circles during free play, apparently listening to instructions for games I didn't recognize. Sometimes they would sing together in unison, but the songs weren't anything I'd taught them or that they could have learned from modern children's media. The songs were the most disturbing aspect. They were clearly children's songs, with simple melodies and repetitive lyrics, but they sounded archaic, like folk songs from a much earlier era. The children sang them perfectly, with pronunciation that seemed oddly formal for their age. One song in particular made me uncomfortable. "Ring around the garden, pocket full of flowers, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. When the sickness comes to take us, we will play until we're found." It was similar to "Ring Around the Rosie," but with darker lyrics that seemed inappropriate for such young children. When I asked where they'd learned it, they invariably pointed toward the shrine and mentioned the friends who remember the old days. I tried redirecting their play toward more conventional activities, but they consistently returned to these mysterious games and songs. More concerning, they seemed to know rules and variations that became increasingly elaborate over time, as if they were being taught by someone with extensive knowledge of historical children's entertainment. During the third week of November, I decided to research the history of our location. If the children were somehow picking up cultural memories from the shrine area, I wanted to understand what they might be connecting with. What I discovered at the ward office made my blood run cold. Kompira Shrine had indeed been built over a significant historical site, but not the kind of peaceful location I'd assumed. In the 1870s, during the early Meiji period, the area had housed the Sumida Children's Home, an orphanage that cared for children who had lost their families to poverty, disease, or the social upheaval of the era. In 1879, a cholera epidemic swept through Tokyo, hitting institutional facilities particularly hard. The Sumida Children's Home was devastated, losing 43 children and 6 caregivers over the course of 3 weeks. The facility never reopened, and Kompira Shrine was built on the site a decade later as a memorial to those who had died. The records included heartbreaking details about the children who had perished ages 3 to 14, mostly from families that had been displaced by the rapid modernization of Japanese society. They had died far from any relatives who might have claimed their bodies and were buried in a mass grave beneath what was now the shrine's main grounds. Armed with this knowledge, I began paying closer attention to the children's play patterns and the content of their mysterious songs. The lyrics often referenced themes of illness, separation from families, and finding comfort in friendship during difficult times. The games involved elaborate rules about taking turns, sharing resources fairly, and caring for those who were sick or sad. I realized with growing horror that my daycare children were learning entertainment from the spirits of orphaned children who had died over a century ago. Children who were still seeking playmates and companionship in their eternal existence. But the situation became more complex than simple supernatural contact. The invisible friends seemed to be having a positive influence on the children in my care. Their social skills improved dramatically as they learned to be more considerate of each other's needs. They became better at sharing, more patient with disagreements, and remarkably gentle with any child who was upset or unwell. The ghost children appeared to be teaching valuable lessons about compassion and community cooperation, drawn from their own experiences of facing hardship together in the orphanage. However, I was concerned about the psychological impact of sustained contact with spirits, especially on such young minds. I consulted with Yamada-san, the priest at Kampira Shrine, hoping he might have insights about managing supernatural encounters in the vicinity of the memorial site. This has happened before, he admitted, when I explained the situation. Every few years, young children in the neighborhood begin interacting with the spirits of the orphanage children. It's not harmful, but it can be intense. What should I do? The spirits aren't malevolent, they're just lonely. They've been seeking companionship for over a century, and they're drawn to places where living children gather. Your daycare provides exactly the kind of social environment they remember from their orphanage days. Yamada-san explained that completely blocking the contact would be difficult and potentially unnecessary, but he could provide protective measures to ensure the interactions remained positive and didn't become overwhelming for the living children. The key is establishing boundaries, he said. Let the spirits know that your children have their own lives and families, and the supernatural friendships can't interfere with normal development. He taught me purification rituals to perform each morning before the children arrived, and provided small protective amulets for each child to wear. The goal wasn't to eliminate the supernatural contact, but to ensure it remained supplementary to, rather than dominant in their social development. We also established a formal memorial practice. Each week, the children and I would visit the shrine to leave flowers and say prayers for the orphan children who had died there. This gave the spirits regular acknowledgement while creating clear boundaries between supernatural interaction and normal daycare activities. The approach worked well. The invisible friends still visited during playtime, but their presence became less dominant. The children learned to distinguish between their living playmates and their historical friends, understanding that both relationships were valuable but served different purposes. The ghost children taught patience, kindness, and historical games that enriched the living children's cultural knowledge. In return, the living children provided the companionship and joy that the spirits had been seeking for over a century. 6 months have passed since we implemented the memorial practice and protective boundaries. The supernatural interactions continue, but they've become integrated into the daycare routine in a way that feels natural and beneficial, rather than disturbing. The children in my care have developed remarkable empathy and social skills, influenced by their relationships with spirits who understand loss and the importance of caring for each other during difficult times. Their play includes both modern activities and historical games that connect them to Japan's cultural heritage. Parents have noticed the positive changes in their promised children's behavior, though I've chosen not to share the supernatural aspects of our daycare experience. Some knowledge is better kept private, especially when the results speak for themselves through improved kindness and social development. I've learned that not all supernatural encounters require elimination or avoidance. Sometimes spirits seek connection rather than causing harm, and providing appropriate boundaries allows both the living and the dead to benefit from carefully managed interactions. The orphan children who died in the cholera epidemic of 1879 continued to seek the friendship and play that death stole from them. My daycare children provide that companionship while learning valuable lessons about compassion, sharing, and cultural continuity. It's an unusual childcare situation, but one that honors both the needs of living children and the eternal longing of those who died too young to experience the full joy of childhood friendships. Sometimes the best solutions to supernatural problems involve accommodation and respect rather than banishment and fear. The Night Shift Temple Security. My name is Watanabe Kenji, and I work night security at Zenkoji Temple in Nagano. What I'm about to tell you happened during the winter months of 2024 to 2025, when I was 53 years old and thought I understood everything about working alone in sacred spaces after dark. I'd been unemployed for 8 months after the factory where I'd worked for 20 years closed down and moved operations overseas. At my age, finding new employment was nearly impossible. Most companies preferred younger workers they could train and pay lower wages. My savings were running out, and my wife was working double shifts at the convenience store to keep up with our mortgage payments. The security job at Zenkoji Temple wasn't ideal, but it was steady work that paid enough to cover our basic expenses. The temple had recently upgraded their insurance requirements and needed someone to patrol the grounds overnight, ensuring no damage occurred to the historic buildings and protecting valuable artifacts from theft. Yamamoto-san, the current head priest who hired me, was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who seemed genuinely concerned about providing employment to local residents struggling with economic displacement. "The work is straightforward," he explained during my interview. "Walk the grounds every 2 hours, check that all buildings are secure, and call the police if you notice anything unusual. The temple has been here for over 1400 years. We just need someone to watch over it during the quiet hours." The pay was modest but regular, 18,000 yen for each 12-hour shift, 3 nights per week. Combined with my wife's income, it would be enough to maintain our household while I continued searching for better employment. Zenkoji Temple is one of Japan's most significant Buddhist sites, attracting thousands of pilgrims annually. During the day, the grounds bustled with visitors, tour groups, and religious ceremonies. But at night, the ancient buildings settled into profound silence, broken only by wind through the towering pine trees and occasional sounds from the surrounding city. My shift ran from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m., with required patrol rounds every 2 hours. The temple complex was extensive: multiple halls, pagodas, residential buildings for monks, and administrative offices spread across several acres of carefully maintained grounds. The first few weeks were peaceful. I established a routine of reading mystery novels between patrol rounds, drinking coffee from a thermos, and enjoying the meditative quiet of working in such a historically significant location. The ancient buildings had a comforting presence, as if centuries of prayers and devotion had created an atmosphere of spiritual protection. It was during my 4th week that I first encountered the monk. I was conducting my midnight patrol, walking the stone path between the main hall and the smaller worship buildings, when I saw an elderly figure in traditional Buddhist robes walking slowly ahead of me. He moved with the careful, measured pace of someone advanced in age, his bald head reflecting moonlight as he proceeded toward the main hall. My first thought was that one of the resident monks was conducting late-night prayers or meditation. I knew several elderly priests lived on the temple grounds, and it wasn't unusual for deeply devout practitioners to maintain irregular spiritual schedules. "Excuse me," I called softly, not wanting to disturb his concentration, but needing to acknowledge his presence as part of my security duties. The figure didn't respond, but continued walking at the same steady pace. As I followed at a respectful distance, I noticed his robes appeared unusually formal, the deep saffron color and elaborate draping of ceremonial vestments rather than everyday monastic clothing. He walked directly to the main hall and climbed the wooden steps with slow deliberation. At the entrance, he paused, bowed deeply toward the interior, and then simply faded from view like morning mist touched by sunlight. I stood alone on the temple path, staring at the empty entrance steps and trying to process what I'd witnessed. The logical explanation was that the elderly monk had simply entered the hall and moved beyond my line of sight. But the way he'd disappeared seemed too sudden and complete for ordinary movement. I completed my patrol round and returned to the security office, making a note in the log about encountering a temple resident during late-night devotions. But I found myself thinking about the monk's formal robes and the strange way he'd vanished at the hall entrance. The next night, during my midnight patrol, I saw him again. Same location, same slow pace, same formal robes, This time I followed more closely, watching as he approached the main hall with what appeared to be ritualistic precision. Again, he paused at the entrance, bowed deeply, and disappeared. This pattern continued for a week. Every night at exactly midnight, the elderly monk would appear on the path, walk to the main hall, bow at the entrance, and vanish. His route never varied, his timing was perfectly consistent, and he never acknowledged my presence despite my repeated attempts to speak with him. I began arriving early for my midnight patrol to observe the phenomenon from different angles. No matter where I positioned myself, the results were identical. The monk would appear, complete his walk to the hall, and disappear at the entrance. More unsettling, I started noticing that his appearance had an otherworldly quality. His movements seemed too smooth, as if he were gliding rather than walking. And despite the winter cold that made my own breath visible, I never saw vapor around the monk's face. After 2 weeks of nightly encounters, I decided to research the temple's recent history. If I was dealing with a supernatural phenomenon, I needed to understand what might be causing it. At the Nagano City Library, I found newspaper archives and temple records that provided disturbing context for what I'd been witnessing. 6 months before I was hired, Zenkoji Temple had lost its previous head priest, Tanaka-san, who had served the temple for over 30 years. According to the records, he had died of a sudden heart attack during evening prayers in the main hall. The newspaper article described him as a deeply devoted priest who maintained rigorous spiritual disciplines despite his advanced age. On the night of his death, he had been conducting private evening prayers, a routine he'd followed every night for decades, as part of his commitment to the temple's spiritual maintenance. Security cameras had recorded him entering the main hall at 11:45 p.m. for his usual devotions. When morning came and he failed to appear for dawn services, other monks found him collapsed on the prayer mat before the main altar, apparently having died while in the middle of his nightly spiritual practice. The timing aligned perfectly with my encounters. The monk I'd been seeing appeared at midnight and walked toward the main hall exactly when and where Tanaka-san would have been conducting his final prayers. I was witnessing the spirit of the former head priest, still attempting to complete the evening devotions that death had interrupted. Armed with this knowledge, I approached my next encounter differently. Instead of trying to speak with the apparition, I followed respectfully at a distance, observing his behavior with new understanding. As usual, he appeared at midnight and walked slowly toward the main hall. But this time, I noticed additional details that confirmed my supernatural theory. His feet didn't quite touch the stone path, leaving no sound despite the gravel surface that crunched under my own steps. And when he passed under the temple's security lights, he cast no shadow. At the hall entrance, he performed the same deep bow as always. But instead of simply disappearing, he seemed to struggle with the doorway itself, reaching forward as if encountering some invisible barrier that prevented him from entering. I realized he was trying to complete his interrupted prayers, but couldn't access the sacred space where his physical death had occurred. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Yamamoto-san to discuss what I'd been experiencing. "I need to tell you about something I've been seeing during my night shifts," I said, describing the repeated encounters with the elderly monk. Yamamoto-san listened with gravity rather than skepticism. "You're seeing Tanaka-san, aren't you?" I nodded, relieved that he understood immediately. "I wondered when this would begin," he said sadly. "Tanaka-san was so devoted to his evening prayer routine that I feared his spirit might remain bound to that practice. Some monks have reported sensing his presence, but you're the first to see him directly. Is there anything that can be done to help him? His spirit is caught between his dedication to completing his final prayers and whatever barrier prevents him from entering the hall where he died. Traditional Buddhist teaching suggests that attachment to routine can bind spirits to earthly locations." Yamamoto-san explained that the temple had consulted with spiritual practitioners about the situation, but finding the right solution was complicated by the fact that Tanaka-san's attachment came from devotion rather than anger or unfinished worldly business. He's not a malevolent spirit, Yamamoto-san continued. He's simply a priest who died in the middle of his sacred duties and feels compelled to complete them. But his spiritual form can't access the physical space where those duties were meant to be performed. After consulting with Buddhist scholars and exorcism specialists, the temple decided to implement a compassionate solution. Each night at midnight, Yamamoto-san would unlock the main hall and leave it accessible for 30 minutes, allowing Tanaka-san's spirit to complete his interrupted prayers. I would continue my security duties, but was asked to serve as a witness to the former priest's nightly devotions, ensuring he could practice in peace while maintaining protection for the temple. The arrangement worked beautifully. When midnight approached, I would unlock the main hall as instructed, then position myself at a respectful distance to observe. Tanaka-san's spirit would appear on schedule, walk to the hall, and this time successfully enter. Through the windows, I could see the faint outline of his figure kneeling before the altar, apparently conducting the same prayers he'd practiced for 30 years. After exactly 25 minutes, the duration his evening prayers had typically required, he would emerge from the hall, bow toward the entrance, and fade peacefully into the night. This routine has continued for 6 months now. Tanaka-san completes his nightly devotions, and I ensure his spiritual practice proceeds undisturbed. The temple maintains its security coverage while honoring the dedication of a priest whose death couldn't diminish his commitment to sacred responsibilities. Working night security has taught me that some supernatural encounters aren't meant to be eliminated, but accommodated with respect and understanding. Tanaka-san's spirit wasn't haunting the temple. He was fulfilling the spiritual obligations that had defined his entire adult life. I've found meaning in serving as guardian of his eternal practice, ensuring he can complete the prayers that death interrupted. It's given my security work deeper purpose beyond simply watching for thieves or vandalism. The temple's solution demonstrates how traditional Buddhist compassion can extend to spirits caught between worlds, providing structure for supernatural phenomena that arise from devotion rather than malice. Sometimes the dead need our help, not to move on, but to complete the sacred work that gave their lives meaning. Witnessing Tanaka-san's nightly prayers reminds me that true spiritual dedication transcends the boundary between life and death, and that serving such dedication, even in its supernatural form, is itself a form of religious practice. The Shrine Cleaning Lady's Curse. My name is Fumiko Matsuda, and I run a small cleaning service in Edogawa Ward. What I'm about to tell you happened during the late summer and autumn of 2024, when I was 41 years old and thought I understood all the challenges that come with maintaining traditional Japanese religious sites. I started my cleaning business 5 years ago, after my husband's small electronics repair shop closed due to competition from large chain stores. With 2 teenage children and a mortgage to maintain, I needed steady income that could accommodate school schedules and family responsibilities. Cleaning services offered flexible hours and reliable pay, especially contracts with institutions that required regular maintenance. My client base included several small businesses, 2 apartment buildings, and 3 neighborhood shrines that needed weekly cleaning to maintain their appearance for worshipers and tourists. The shrine contracts were particularly valuable because they paid well and involved respectful, meaningful work that connected me to traditional Japanese culture. One of my regular contracts was Hakusan Inari Shrine, a small but historically significant site located just 2 blocks from my apartment building. The shrine was dedicated to Inari, the Shinto deity associated with rice, prosperity, and foxes. Like many Inari shrines, it featured beautiful red torii gates, stone fox statues called kitsune, and traditional wooden buildings that required careful maintenance. The shrine's head priest, Tanaka-san, was an elderly man in his 70s who appreciated having reliable help with cleaning duties that were becoming difficult for him to manage alone. My weekly responsibilities included sweeping the courtyards, cleaning the offering boxes, maintaining the prayer areas, and carefully dusting the various statues and ceremonial objects. The most important thing, Tanaka-san had emphasized during my first week, is treating everything with proper respect. These objects have been blessed and hold spiritual significance. Handle them as you would precious family heirlooms. I took this guidance seriously, always bowing before beginning work and handling religious items with the reverence they deserved. The work was peaceful and meditative, providing a spiritual dimension to what could have been routine cleaning tasks. The shrine housed several pairs of fox statues positioned throughout the grounds, some large and prominent near the main gate, others smaller and tucked into corners where they observed the sacred space with carved stone eyes. Each pair represented different aspects of Inari's protective power, and all had been blessed through decades of prayers and offerings. It was during a routine cleaning session in late August that the accident occurred. I was dusting the smaller fox statues near the side shrine dedicated to business prosperity, working carefully around their intricate carved features. These particular statues were older than the others, with weathered stone and delicate details that required gentle handling. As I reached behind one statue to clean leaves that had accumulated in the corner, my cleaning cloth caught on something and pulled my hand sideways more forcefully than I'd intended. My elbow knocked against the fox statue, sending it toppling from its wooden platform onto the stone pathway below. The crash was horrifying. The statue shattered into several pieces, with the head breaking completely off and one of the carved ears chipping into fragments. I stood frozen, staring at the destruction I'd caused to what I knew was a sacred object that had protected the shrine for possibly decades. My first instinct was to gather the pieces and see if the statue could be repaired. But as I knelt to collect the fragments, I noticed something disturbing. The statue's eyes, which had been closed in peaceful repose, now seemed to be staring directly at me with an expression that looked almost angry. I carefully collected all the pieces and brought them to Tanaka-san immediately, bowing deeply and apologizing profusely for my carelessness. "I'm so sorry, Tanaka-san," I said, presenting the broken statue fragments. "I'll pay for replacement or repairs, whatever is needed. I was being too hasty with my cleaning." Tanaka-san examined the broken pieces with a grave expression that worried me more than anger would have. "This statue has been here for over 60 years, he said quietly. "It was blessed by my predecessor and has protected this shrine through decades of changes in the neighborhood. Is there anything that can be done to fix it? The statue can be repaired by a craftsman, but that's not the main concern." He looked at me with genuine worry. "Fumiko-san, when sacred fox statues are disturbed or damaged, especially accidentally, it can attract attention from the Inari spirits. They may interpret the damage as disrespect, even if that wasn't your intention." I felt my stomach drop. What kind of attention? Fox spirits are known to be persistent. When they feel their sacred objects have been mistreated, you may experience unusual occurrences until proper amends are made. Tanaka-san explained that Inari spirits weren't malevolent, but they had strong connections to concepts of respect, reciprocity, and proper treatment of sacred spaces. Accidentally damaging their representations could be seen as a breach of the spiritual contract between humans and the divine forces that protected the shrine. What should I do? Continue your work normally, but be prepared for signs that the fox spirits are taking notice of you. If strange things begin happening, we'll need to perform specific rituals to restore harmony between you and the Inari Kami. I left the shrine that day feeling deeply unsettled, but I hoped that my sincere apology and willingness to make repairs would be sufficient to prevent any supernatural consequences. I was wrong. The first signs appeared that very evening. As I was preparing dinner in my apartment kitchen, I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, quick flashes of red that disappeared when I turned to look directly. Initially, I assumed it was evening light, reflecting off neighborhood signs or passing cars. But over the following days, the sightings became more frequent and distinct. Small red-eyed shapes would appear in corners of rooms, behind furniture, or in shadows cast by everyday objects. They were never there when I looked directly, but my peripheral vision consistently registered fox-like forms watching me with glowing red eyes. The phenomena weren't confined to my apartment. During my daily routine shopping for groceries, taking the train to other cleaning jobs, walking through the neighborhood, I would see the same red-eyed watchers positioned in alleys, behind buildings, or in shadowy areas along my path. My family began noticing changes in my behavior. I became nervous and distracted, constantly glancing around as if expecting to see something lurking nearby. Sleep became difficult because I felt watched even in my own bedroom, with red eyes occasionally visible in the darkness when I closed my eyes. "Mama, are you okay?" my daughter Yuki asked one morning. "You seem scared all the time lately." I couldn't explain the situation without sounding irrational, so I attributed my nervousness to work stress and promised to be more relaxed. But the supernatural attention was escalating. The fox watchers were appearing more frequently and staying visible for longer periods. Sometimes I could see them directly, rather than just in peripheral vision, small fox spirits with glowing red eyes, positioned where they could observe my daily activities. They weren't threatening in an aggressive way, but their constant presence felt like being under surveillance by forces I couldn't understand or communicate with. The psychological pressure of knowing I was being watched by supernatural entities was exhausting. After 2 weeks of persistent fox sightings, I returned to Tanaka-san for help. "The Inari spirits are definitely taking notice of you," he confirmed after I described my experiences. "Fox spirits are curious by nature, and they're trying to determine your character and intentions after the accident with their statue. How long will this continue? Until you demonstrate proper respect and make appropriate amends. The spirits need to be satisfied that you understand the significance of what happened and that you're committed to honoring their sacred space appropriately." Tanaka-san explained the traditional process for appeasing offended Inari spirits. It involves specific offerings, formal apologies conducted according to Shinto protocol, and a commitment to ongoing respectful behavior toward the shrine and its spiritual inhabitants. The key is showing that the accident has taught you deeper respect for sacred objects, rather than making you careless or dismissive of spiritual traditions. The ritual process was more complex than I'd expected. For 7 consecutive days, I had to bring specific offerings to the shrine: rice, sake, and fried tofu, which were traditional foods associated with Inari worship. Each day, I performed formal bows and spoke aloud my apologies and promises to treat the shrine with even greater care. Additionally, I had to demonstrate my commitment by taking on extra cleaning duties without additional payment, showing that my dedication to maintaining the sacred space came from respect rather than just economic necessity. The process was emotionally intensive. Speaking formal apologies to spiritual entities I couldn't see required overcoming feelings of self-consciousness and embracing traditional beliefs that my modern lifestyle had somewhat neglected. But gradually, the fox watchers began appearing less frequently. By the 4th day of offerings, the red-eyed sightings were limited to the shrine grounds themselves rather than following me throughout my daily routine. By the 7th day, I felt the oppressive sense of being watched lift entirely. The broken fox statue was repaired by a craftsman who specialized in religious sculpture, and when it was returned to its proper position, Tanaka-san conducted a re-blessing ceremony that formally restored its spiritual function. 6 months have passed since the accident, and my relationship with Hakusan Inari Shrine has deepened significantly. The supernatural attention taught me to appreciate the spiritual dimensions of my cleaning work, rather than treating it as purely practical maintenance. I now begin each shrine visit with more formal prayers and offerings, acknowledging the presence of the fox spirits and expressing gratitude for their protection of the sacred space. My cleaning has become more ritualistic, with proper procedures that honor the spiritual significance of each object and area. The fox watchers still appear occasionally, but now their presence feels protective rather than intrusive. Sometimes, when I'm working alone at the shrine, I'll catch glimpses of red eyes observing my work with what seems like approval rather than suspicion. My experience taught me that traditional Japanese spiritual beliefs aren't just cultural relics, but living systems that respond to human behavior and intentions. The Inari spirits weren't punishing me for an honest mistake. They were evaluating my character and commitment to respectful relationships with sacred forces. The cleaning business has prospered since I developed deeper respect for the spiritual aspects of maintaining religious sites. Word has spread that I approach shrine maintenance with proper reverence, and I've gained contracts with several additional temples and shrines whose priests appreciate my understanding of traditional protocols. More importantly, the experience connected me to spiritual practices that had been dormant in my adult life. Taking time for proper prayers, offerings, and respectful interaction with sacred spaces has provided stability and meaning during economically uncertain times. The fox spirits taught me that some relationships require ongoing attention and respect rather than one-time transactions. Maintaining harmony with the supernatural forces that inhabit sacred spaces is an ongoing responsibility that enriches both the cleaning work and my understanding of Japanese spiritual traditions. I still see the red-eyed watchers sometimes, but now I greet them with respectful acknowledgement rather than fear. They've become spiritual colleagues who share my commitment to maintaining the sacred spaces where traditional Japanese culture intersects with the modern world. The Temple Gift Shop. Horror. My name is Ryoko Ishida, and I work part-time at the gift shop beside Sensoji Temple in Asakusa. What I'm about to tell you happened during the busy tourist season of 2024, when I was 23 years old and supplementing my university studies with retail work at one of Tokyo's most famous religious sites. I'd been working at the temple gift shop for 8 months, ever since my parents cut my allowance and told me I needed to earn my own spending money. The job paid reasonably well for part-time work, 1,200 yen per hour, and the location was convenient, just a 30-minute train ride from my university in Shibuya. The shop specialized in traditional religious items and tourist souvenirs, wooden prayer plaques called ima, protective amulets known as omamori, incense, small Buddhist statues, and various trinkets that visitors could take home as reminders of their temple visit. During peak tourist seasons, we sold hundreds of items daily to both Japanese visitors and international tourists seeking authentic spiritual mementos. My supervisor, Tanaka-san, was a middle-aged woman who had worked at the temple for over 15 years. She taught me the proper way to handle religious merchandise with respect, explaining the spiritual significance of different items and how to help customers choose appropriate protective amulets for their specific needs. Remember, she always emphasized, these aren't just souvenirs. The omamori are properly blessed by the temple priests and carry real spiritual power. We have a responsibility to ensure customers receive items that will genuinely protect and benefit them. The omamori were our most popular products, small cloth pouches containing prayers written on paper or wood, blessed by temple priests to provide protection for specific aspects of life. We carried amulets for traffic safety, academic success, good health, business prosperity, and romantic relationships. Each type had distinct colors and designs, and customers often spent considerable time selecting the right protection for their circumstances. Our inventory system was straightforward, but required careful attention. Each morning, I would count the omamori in each display case, noting which varieties were running low and needed restocking. At closing time, I would count again to track daily sales and identify popular items. The temple's blessing schedule meant we received new blessed amulets twice weekly, and maintaining accurate inventory was essential for proper reordering. It was during my 4th month that I first noticed the anomaly with the omamori returns. I was conducting the morning inventory count when I discovered that several amulets I distinctly remembered selling the previous day were back in their display positions. Specifically, 3 traffic safety amulets and 2 academic success charms were present, despite my clear memory of selling them to tourists who had specifically requested those protections. Initially, I assumed I'd made an error in my record keeping. Part-time retail work can be repetitive, and it seemed possible that I'd confused similar transactions or miscounted during busy periods. But when the same phenomenon occurred the next morning, with different specific amulets that I was certain had been sold, I began paying more careful attention to my sales transactions and inventory tracking. Over the following week, I implemented a more rigorous counting system, photographing the display cases at opening and closing to create visual records of inventory changes. The photographic evidence was undeniable. Certain omamori were disappearing during business hours when I sold them to customers, then reappearing overnight in their exact original display positions. The pattern wasn't random. Only specific amulets exhibited this behavior, always the same individual pieces, recognizable by small distinguishing marks like fabric patterns or slight color variations. Other omamori of the same types would sell normally and remain sold, but these particular pieces consistently returned to the shop despite being taken away by customers who had paid for them. More disturbing, the returning amulets showed signs of having been handled. The fabric pouches appeared slightly worn, as if they'd been carried in pockets or purses, and sometimes they smelled faintly of perfume or cigarettes that suggested contact with their temporary owners. I decided to investigate by discreetly following up with customers who had purchased the problematic amulets. Using our credit card records, I contacted several tourists who had bought the items that mysteriously returned. The responses were deeply unsettling. 3 different customers reported that their purchased omamori had vanished from their belongings within 24 hours of leaving the temple. One woman said the amulet had disappeared from her purse while she was sleeping in her hotel room. A businessman claimed his traffic safety charm had vanished from his car's dashboard overnight. A student reported that her academic success amulet had disappeared from her backpack during a train journey. None of the customers seemed suspicious of supernatural causes. They assumed they had simply lost the items through ordinary carelessness. But the consistent pattern of disappearances, combined with the amulet's mysterious return to our shop, suggested something beyond normal misplacement. I brought the situation to Tanaka-san's attention, expecting her to be skeptical of my supernatural theory. Instead, her expression grew grave when I described the specific amulets that were exhibiting this behavior. "Show me exactly which ones," she said, following me to the display cases. When I pointed out the problematic omamori, Tanaka-san examined them carefully, checking small markings on their fabric covers that I hadn't noticed before. "These are from the blessing ceremony conducted by Yamada-san in early spring," she said quietly. She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Before he what?" "Before he took his own life," she finished reluctantly. Yamada-san was one of the temple priests who blessed these particular batches of omamori. He died by suicide 2 months after the blessing ceremony. I felt my stomach drop. "Are you saying these amulets are cursed?" "Not cursed exactly, but potentially compromised. When a priest who has blessed religious items dies under tragic circumstances, especially suicide, their spiritual energy can become unstable. The items they blessed may carry that spiritual disturbance." Tanaka-san explained that suicide was considered particularly spiritually contaminating in traditional Buddhist belief, as it represented a soul departing in extreme anguish and mental turmoil. When such a person had blessed religious items intended to provide protection and peace, the contradiction between their final mental state and the amulet's purpose could create spiritual dysfunction. The omamori are trying to return to the temple because they can't fulfill their protective function properly. she continued. Yamada-san's tormented spirit may be interfering with their ability to provide the blessings they were meant to offer. Are they dangerous to customers? Potentially. Instead of providing protection, they might carry spiritual contamination from Yamada-san's final emotional state. Customers could experience increased anxiety, depression, or spiritual unrest, rather than the peace and protection they're seeking. This revelation horrified me. I realized that I had been unknowingly selling spiritually compromised items to innocent customers who trusted that temple merchandise would provide legitimate religious benefits. The returning amulets weren't just mysterious, they were potentially harmful. Tanaka-san immediately contacted the head priest to report the situation. After examining the problematic omamori and consulting temple records, he confirmed that they had indeed been blessed by Yamada-san during his final weeks of life, when colleagues had noticed he was struggling with severe depression and spiritual crisis. We should have anticipated this possibility, the head priest admitted. When priests bless items while experiencing severe mental disturbance, the blessings can become contaminated with their suffering. The temple's solution was both practical and compassionate. All omamori blessed by Yamada-san during his final months were removed from sale and subjected to purification rituals designed to cleanse them of spiritual contamination. The process involved multiple blessing ceremonies conducted by different priests to overwrite the compromised spiritual energy with stable protective power. Additionally, the temple implemented new protocols for monitoring the mental health of priests who conducted blessing ceremonies, recognizing that the spiritual state of the blessing practitioner directly affected the effectiveness of the religious items they consecrated. However, the purification process revealed the depth of Yamada-san's spiritual disturbance. Even after multiple cleansing ceremonies, some of the omamori continued to exhibit supernatural behavior, returning to the temple overnight or causing unease in people who handled them. The head priest concluded that Yamada-san's spirit remained bound to the items he had blessed, unable to rest peacefully, while knowing his final spiritual work had been compromised by his mental anguish. Traditional exorcism approaches were insufficient because his attachment came from guilt and responsibility, rather than anger or earthly desires. The temple's final solution was to establish a memorial service for Yamada-san, acknowledging his years of dedicated service while asking for forgiveness for his final actions. During the ceremony, the compromised omamori were formally released from their protective obligations and converted into memorial objects that honored Yamada-san's positive contributions to the temple community. This approach succeeded in calming the supernatural disturbances, but the experience fundamentally changed how I understood the spiritual mechanics of religious retail work. I learned that blessed objects carry the spiritual energy of their creators, and that mental health crises can contaminate religious practices with unintended consequences. 6 months have passed since we resolved the omamori situation. I continue working at the temple gift shop, but with much deeper awareness of the spiritual responsibilities involved in selling blessed items. I pay attention to the priests who conduct blessing ceremonies, watching for signs of stress or spiritual disturbance that might affect their work. The temple has implemented regular mental health check-ins for clergy and established support systems for priests experiencing spiritual crises. The goal is to prevent future situations where personal anguish contaminates religious practices that are meant to provide comfort and protection to others. My retail work has gained spiritual dimensions that I never anticipated when I first took the job for spending money. I now understand that selling blessed items involves responsibility for their spiritual integrity and the well-being of customers who trust in their protective power. The experience taught me that traditional religious practices aren't immune to mental health issues, and that spiritual institutions must address psychological well-being to maintain the effectiveness of their religious services. Sometimes protecting people's spiritual welfare requires acknowledging and treating the mental health struggles of those who provide spiritual guidance. Working in a temple gift shop has become more than just a part-time job. It's a responsibility for ensuring that the intersection between commerce and spirituality maintains its integrity and serves people's genuine needs for protection and peace. The Gravestone Delivery Man. My name is Koji Nakamura, and I work as an assistant to my uncle's stonemasonry business in Nerima Ward. What I'm about to tell you happened during the autumn and winter of 2024, when I was 26 years old and thought I understood all the challenges that come with working in Tokyo's funeral industry. I started working for my uncle Hiroshi after graduating from technical school with no clear career direction and mounting student loan debt. The stonemasonry business wasn't glamorous, but it provided steady work and decent pay around 250,000 yen per month, plus overtime during busy seasons when families needed monuments completed quickly for memorial services. Our work involved crafting and installing gravestones, memorial markers, and Buddhist stupas for families throughout the Tokyo metropolitan area. Most of our business came through partnerships with funeral homes and temples that referred clients seeking quality stone work for their family burial sites. The job required both artistic skill and physical strength. We carved family names, dates, and memorial messages into granite and marble, using traditional tools and modern machinery. Installation involved heavy lifting, precise measurements, and respectful interaction with grieving families during some of their most difficult moments. My uncle had built a reputation for respectful service and quality craftsmanship over 20 years in business. We're not just making stone markers, he always told me. We're creating permanent memorials that will honor these families for generations. That's a sacred responsibility. The work sites were primarily cemeteries attached to Buddhist temples throughout Tokyo and neighboring prefectures. Each location had its own protocols for contractors, specific requirements for stone types and sizing, and established relationships with groundskeepers who facilitated our installations. One of our regular locations was the cemetery behind Rinai Temple in Toshima Ward, where we typically installed 4 or 5 new gravestones monthly. The cemetery was well maintained, with traditional Buddhist grave markers arranged in orderly rows among carefully pruned pine trees and stone lanterns. The work was respectful and meaningful, but it was also emotionally challenging. Families often attended our installations, watching as we permanently marked their loved ones' final resting places. I learned to work quietly and efficiently, while giving families space to grieve and conduct private memorial rituals. It was in late October that I received the first unusual phone call. My phone rang at 11:30 p.m. while I was at home watching television after a long day of installation work. The caller was an elderly woman who spoke in the polite but urgent tone that families often used when discussing funeral arrangements. "Excuse me, Nakamura-san," she said. "I need to request grave repairs for my burial site. The stone is cracking and needs immediate attention." I assumed she was calling about maintenance for a family member's existing grave, something that happened occasionally when weather damage or settling caused problems with older installations. "Of course," I said, reaching for my notebook. "Can you give me your name and the location of the grave that needs repair?" "My name is Sato Michiko. The grave is in Section 12 of Rinai Temple Cemetery. It's my own gravesite, and it needs to be prepared properly." Her phrasing struck me as odd. Most people would say, "my husband's grave," or "my mother's burial site," not refer to it as their own grave. But grief often affected how people express themselves, and I didn't want to seem insensitive by questioning her word choice. "I can visit the site tomorrow to assess the damage and provide a repair estimate," I offered. "No, it must be tonight," she insisted. "The preparation is urgent. I'll meet you there at midnight." Late-night cemetery work was highly unusual, but families sometimes had specific timing requests related to Buddhist memorial traditions or work schedule constraints. I agreed to meet her at the cemetery, assuming she was dealing with some kind of memorial deadline. When I arrived at Rinai Temple Cemetery at midnight, I found an elderly woman in her 70s waiting near the entrance gate. She appeared healthy and alert, dressed in formal dark clothing appropriate for cemetery visits. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, bowing politely. "The grave site is this way." She led me through the cemetery to section 12, where rows of traditional Buddhist gravestones stood under moonlight, filtering through pine branches. But when we reached the location she'd specified, I found only empty ground marked by a small, temporary stake with her name written on paper. "I don't see any existing gravestone that needs repair," I said, confused. "Not yet," she replied matter-of-factly. "But it needs to be installed soon. The ground must be prepared, the foundation poured, and the stone carved with my name and death date." I stared at her, realizing with growing alarm what she was requesting. "Ma'am, are you asking me to prepare your own burial site while you're still alive?" "Yes. It's very important that everything is ready. I won't have much time once the calling becomes stronger." Her calm, rational tone made the conversation even more disturbing. She spoke about her own death preparation as if discussing routine home maintenance, showing no signs of depression or suicidal ideation, just practical urgency about completing burial arrangements. "Mrs. Sato, I think there may be some confusion. We typically don't prepare grave sites for living people unless they're making advance arrangements through proper legal channels with the temple. The arrangements are necessary," she said firmly. "Something is calling me, and I need to be ready when it's time to answer." I suggested she speak with her family or a doctor about her concerns, but she insisted that the grave preparation was her immediate priority. When I declined to begin work without proper authorization from the temple, she became agitated and walked away into the darkness, muttering about finding someone else who would understand the urgency. I returned home deeply unsettled by the encounter, but I assumed I dealt with an elderly person experiencing some form of confusion or mental health crisis. I made a note to mention the incident to my uncle and forgot about it. But 3 nights later, I received another similar call. This time, the caller was an elderly man named Takeshi, who requested immediate grave preparation at the same cemetery. Like Mrs. Sato, he spoke about his own burial needs with calm urgency, insisting that the work couldn't be delayed. "The stone must be ready soon," he explained. "I can feel something pulling me toward the cemetery, and I need to have proper arrangements in place." When I declined to meet him for late-night grave preparation, he became frustrated and hung up, but I was beginning to recognize a disturbing pattern in these requests. Over the following 2 weeks, I received 7 more late-night calls from elderly residents, requesting urgent preparation of their own grave sites. All were articulate and rational sounding, all insisted on immediate work, and all spoke about sensing some kind of calling or pull toward death that required advanced burial preparation. Most disturbing, when I checked with Rinai Temple, I discovered that none of these callers had made official arrangements for burial plots, and none had terminal illnesses or obvious reasons to be planning immediate funeral preparations. I began keeping detailed records of the calls, names, addresses, specific requests, and the unusual language they used to describe their urgency about death preparation. The pattern was consistent enough to suggest something beyond individual mental health issues. When I shared my concerns with my uncle, he listened with growing seriousness. "This reminds me of stories my father used to tell," he said thoughtfully. "Sometimes, when spiritual forces are disturbed around burial sites, they can create unnatural attractions that call living people toward death before their natural time." He explained that traditional Japanese beliefs included warnings about supernatural influences that could compel people to seek premature death, particularly around cemeteries where spiritual energy was concentrated. If multiple elderly people are experiencing similar compulsions toward death preparation, there may be spiritual contamination around that cemetery that needs to be addressed. My uncle suggested consulting with the head priest at Rinai Temple to determine if there had been recent changes or disturbances that might have affected the spiritual balance of the burial grounds. When I met with Yamamoto-san, the temple's head priest, he listened to my account with grave concern. "We've had unusual spiritual activity around the cemetery recently," he admitted. "Several families have reported sensing restless energy during memorial visits, and our groundskeeper mentioned seeing figures walking through the burial grounds at night." He revealed that 3 months earlier, construction work for expanding the cemetery had accidentally disturbed a section of unmarked graves from the Meiji era, potentially releasing spiritual energy from improperly honored burial sites. When ancient graves are disturbed without proper ritual protocols, the displaced spirits can create spiritual contamination that affects the entire cemetery. Yamamoto-san explained, "Living people who are spiritually sensitive may feel drawn to the burial grounds, experiencing compulsions toward death that aren't natural to their life circumstances." The temple had been planning to address the spiritual disturbance through purification ceremonies, but they hadn't realized the probably contamination was affecting people beyond the cemetery grounds. Yamamoto-san immediately arranged for intensive purification rituals to cleanse the disturbed burial area and establish protective barriers around the cemetery perimeter. The process involved multiple priests conducting ceremonies over several days to appease the displaced spirits and restore spiritual balance to the burial grounds. During the purification period, I continued receiving occasional late-night calls from elderly residents, but their urgency seemed less intense, and several callers mentioned that the pulling sensation they'd been experiencing was beginning to fade. After the temple completed its spiritual cleansing work, the unusual phone calls stopped entirely. I followed up with several of the callers to check on their well-being, and all reported that their compulsions toward death preparation had disappeared completely. The experience taught me that working in funeral industries involves responsibilities beyond just physical craftsmanship and customer service. When your work brings you into regular contact with death and burial sites, you can become aware of spiritual disturbances that affect both the living and the dead. 6 months have passed since the cemetery purification ceremonies, and I haven't received any more supernatural requests for grave preparation. But the experience changed how I understand my role in the funeral industry. I now pay attention to spiritual aspects of cemetery work that I'd previously ignored, watching for signs of supernatural disturbance that might affect grieving families or influence people inappropriately. My uncle has taught me basic protective practices to use when working in spiritually active locations. Most importantly, I've learned that some supernatural phenomena require intervention to protect vulnerable people from forces they can't understand or control. The elderly residents who called me weren't choosing to prepare for premature death. They were being influenced by spiritual contamination that created unnatural compulsions toward ending their lives. Working with death and burial sites requires awareness of spiritual forces that can affect both the living and the dead. And sometimes, protecting people means recognizing when supernatural influences are pushing them toward harmful decisions they wouldn't normally make. The stone masonry business has given me deeper appreciation for the intersection between traditional Japanese spiritual beliefs and modern funeral practices, and the ongoing responsibility to ensure that both serve the well-being of living families and the peaceful rest of the departed. The Temple Guest House Secret. My name is Emiko Watanabe, and I manage the guest house attached to Kongobuji Temple on Mount Koya. What I'm about to tell you happened during my 3rd year of service in 2024, when I thought I understood all the challenges that come with providing accommodation for spiritual pilgrims at one of Japan's most sacred Buddhist sites. I came to Mount Koya after my divorce, seeking both employment and spiritual healing in the quiet mountain environment. The guest house manager position offered modest pay, but included housing, meals, and the opportunity to participate in temple life while maintaining my independence. After years of struggling with my ex-husband's drinking and the emotional turmoil of our failed marriage, the peaceful routine of serving Buddhist pilgrims felt like a form of therapy. Mount Koya, or Koyasan as it's traditionally known, is the center of Shingon Buddhism in Japan, founded over 1,200 years ago by the monk Kobo Daishi. The temple complex houses numerous guest accommodations for pilgrims who come to experience traditional Buddhist life, participate in morning prayers, and visit the sacred cemetery, where Kobo Daishi is believed to rest in eternal meditation. Our guest house, Shukubo Reihokan, could accommodate 30 guests in traditional tatami mat rooms. Most visitors stayed 2 or 3 nights, participating in morning prayers at 5:30 a.m., eating traditional Buddhist vegetarian meals, and spending their days in meditation or exploring the temple grounds. My responsibilities included managing reservations, preparing guest rooms, coordinating meal service with the temple kitchen, and ensuring visitors understood the protocols for respectful behavior in the sacred environment. The work required attention to detail and sensitivity to the spiritual needs of people who often came to Mount Koya during difficult periods in their lives. The guest house had 8 single rooms and 11 double rooms, each furnished with traditional bedding, low wooden tables, and simple amenities that encouraged contemplative simplicity. Room 7 was a single room on the 2nd floor, with a small window overlooking the temple's meditation garden. It was during my 2nd month that I first noticed the anomaly with room 7. The room appeared occupied on our booking system, with a reservation under the name Yamada Jiro that showed a check-in date from 3 months earlier, but no departure date. When I checked with the head priest about this long-term guest, he said simply, "Yamada-san has special arrangements. Please continue preparing the room as usual." Following instructions, I maintained room 7 exactly as I would for any other guest, providing fresh bedding, cleaning daily, and delivering meals at the standard times. But I never saw the occupant, despite working in the guest house from early morning until evening. More puzzling, the room showed clear signs of being used. The futon would be unfolded and slept in, requiring fresh linens each morning. The small writing desk would have papers scattered across it, though I could never read the handwriting clearly. Most significantly, the meals I delivered would disappear completely, with empty dishes left outside the door for collection. I assumed Yamada-san was an extremely private person who preferred to avoid interaction with staff and other guests. Some pilgrims came to Mount Koya seeking solitude for intense spiritual practice, and respecting their privacy was part of our service. But as weeks passed, the situation became increasingly strange. The room's occupant appeared to follow an extremely rigid schedule. Every morning at 3 a.m., I would hear footsteps pacing back and forth across the wooden floor of room 7 for exactly 1 hour. At 4 a.m., the sounds would stop abruptly, followed by complete silence until the next morning. The pacing pattern never varied, slow, measured steps from the window to the door and back, as if someone were conducting walking meditation or struggling with some internal conflict that required constant movement to manage. During the day, the room remained completely silent. No sounds of reading, writing, or normal daily activities. Just the empty dishes outside the door and subtle signs that someone had used the bedding and bathing facilities. After 2 months of this routine, I decided to attempt direct contact with the mysterious guest. I knocked softly on the door during what I assumed were waking hours and spoke politely. "Excuse me, Yamada-san. I'm Watanabe from the guest house staff. Is there anything you need for your stay?" Silence. I tried several more times over the following week, always receiving no response despite clear evidence that the room was occupied. The situation was professionally frustrating. I couldn't properly serve a guest I never saw or spoke with. When I expressed my concerns to Tanaka-san, the head priest, he listened with gravity but offered little clarification. "Yamada-san requires special accommodation," he said. "Please continue your service as you have been." he appreciates your discretion and professional care. Is he ill? Does he need medical attention or different meal arrangements? His needs are spiritual rather than physical. Continue as you are. The non-explanation troubled me, but I respected the temple hierarchy and continued maintaining room 7 according to my established routine. It was during my 4th month that I discovered the disturbing truth about Yamada Jiro. I was organizing old guest registration records when I found his original check-in information from 2 years earlier. According to the documents, Yamada Jiro was a 43-year-old businessman from Osaka who had come to Mount Koya for a spiritual retreat following a personal crisis. But attached to his registration was a death certificate dated 3 days after his arrival. The temple records showed that Yamada-san had died of exhaustion and dehydration while attempting an extreme fasting practice in room 7. He had been discovered by temple staff after missing morning prayers for 2 consecutive days, found in a meditative position facing the window, apparently having passed away during his spiritual practice. The records indicated he had been engaging in a traditional but dangerous ascetic practice called Nujoji, where practitioners fast completely while maintaining intensive prayer and meditation schedules. When performed without proper supervision, this practice could lead to physical collapse and death. I stared at the documents in shock, realizing I had been serving meals and maintaining a room for someone who had died 2 years before I even arrived at Mount Koya. That evening, I confronted Tanaka-san directly. I found Yamada-san's death records, I said, showing him the temple documents. He died 2 years ago. What am I actually maintaining in room 7? Tanaka-san sighed deeply. Yamada-san's spirit has never left the room where he died. He continues his spiritual practice in death, still attempting to achieve the enlightenment he was seeking when his body failed him. But I deliver meals that disappear. The bedding gets used. How is that possible? His spiritual energy is so concentrated from his final intensive practice that it can still interact with physical objects. He continues his routine as if he were still alive, unaware that his body has died. Tanaka-san explained that Yamada-san had been so focused on his spiritual goals that his death hadn't interrupted his consciousness. His spirit remained bound to room 7 by the intensity of his final meditation practice, continuing the same routine that had killed his physical body. Why don't you perform an exorcism or help him move on? Because he isn't suffering or causing harm. He's genuinely pursuing enlightenment, just as he was in life. Interfering with someone's sincere spiritual practice would be contrary to Buddhist principles, even if that practice is being conducted by a spirit. The temple had decided to accommodate Yamada-san's posthumous retreat, maintaining the room as if he were still alive, and allowing him to continue his spiritual work without interruption. The monthly payment for his stay came from an automatic bank transfer he had arranged before his death, covering his ongoing accommodation costs. But this is deceiving other guests and staff. Shouldn't people know they're staying in a building with an active spirit? Yamada-san's presence is peaceful and focused entirely on spiritual practice. He doesn't interact with other guests or create disturbances. The accommodation serves both his spiritual needs and the temple's mission to support serious practitioners. Learning the truth about room 7 fundamentally changed my relationship with the guest house work. I was no longer serving a living person, but facilitating the spiritual practice of someone whose devotion had transcended death itself. The realization was both unsettling and oddly moving. Yamada-san had been so committed to his spiritual development that not even death could interrupt his practice. His spirit continued the same intensive routine that had killed his body, apparently still hoping to achieve the enlightenment that had eluded him in life. I continued my service to room 7, but now with full awareness of what I was supporting. Each morning when I delivered meals that would mysteriously disappear, I was participating in the spiritual care of someone whose dedication to Buddhist practice had created a form of posthumous monasticism. The 3 a.m. pacing took on new meaning. It was the sound of a spirit conducting walking meditation, still struggling with whatever internal conflicts had driven him to such extreme ascetic practices. His routine had become eternal, trapped between his spiritual aspirations and the physical limitations that had caused his death. Over time, I developed a respectful relationship with Yamada-san's spirit. Though we never communicated directly, I began leaving small offerings of flowers and incense along with his meals, acknowledging the sincerity of his ongoing spiritual work. 6 months have passed since I learned the truth about Room 7. Yamada-san continues his posthumous retreat, and I continue facilitating his practice through daily room service and respectful accommodation. Other staff members know about the situation, but we maintain professional discretion to protect both Yamada-san's privacy and the temple's reputation. Guests occasionally ask about the occupied room that never seems to have visible occupants, but we explain simply that some practitioners prefer complete solitude during intensive retreats. Working at Mount Koya has taught me that spiritual dedication can transcend normal boundaries between life and death. Yamada-san's spirit demonstrates that some forms of religious practice are so fundamental to a person's identity that they continue beyond physical existence. My own spiritual development has been influenced by witnessing his eternal commitment to practice. His dedication reminds me daily that spiritual work requires persistence and sincerity, even when progress seems impossibly difficult. Managing the guest house has become more than just hospitality work. It's a form of supporting spiritual practice that serves both the living and the dead. Room 7 represents the intersection between traditional Buddhist accommodation and the ongoing spiritual needs of someone whose death couldn't interrupt his devotion to enlightenment. Sometimes the most meaningful service we can provide is simply maintaining space for practices we don't fully understand, but can recognize as sincere attempts to transcend ordinary human limitations. The Shrine Maintenance Apprentice. My name is Daisuke Hayashi, and I work as an apprentice carpenter for Yamamoto Construction, specializing in traditional wooden building restoration. What I'm about to tell you happened during the summer of 2024, when I was 24 years old, and thought I understood all the challenges that come with maintaining Japan's historic religious architecture. I'd been working under Yamamoto-san for 3 years, learning traditional joinery techniques and the specialized skills required for shrine and temple restoration. The work was demanding but rewarding, preserving buildings that had stood for centuries and maintaining the craftsmanship traditions that connected modern Japan to its cultural heritage. When our company received the contract to repair weather damage at Yasukuni Shrine in central Tokyo, I was excited about working on such a historically significant site. The shrine, dedicated to Japan's war dead, required constant maintenance to preserve its traditional wooden structures against the effects of urban pollution, seasonal weather, and millions of annual visitors. The project involved replacing damaged roof beams, repairing intricate bracket systems called Tokyo, and restoring decorative wooden elements that had deteriorated over decades of exposure. The work required traditional hand tools and joinery methods that had been used for over 1,000 years in Japanese carpentry. Yamamoto-san emphasized the spiritual significance of our work. When you're working on sacred buildings, he told me, you're not just fixing wood and nails. You're maintaining structures that house the spiritual energy of countless prayers and ceremonies. The quality of your craftsmanship affects the spiritual integrity of the entire site. The worksite was set up in a workshop area behind the main shrine buildings, where we could prepare custom wooden pieces before installing them in the historic structures. The workshop was equipped with traditional hand tools, planes, chisels, saws, and measuring implements that allowed for the precision required in traditional Japanese joinery. My daily routine involved measuring and cutting replacement pieces according to Yamamoto-san's specifications. then fitting them with traditional joinery techniques that used no nails or screws, only precisely cut wooden joints that locked together through friction and expert craftsmanship. It was during my second week that I first noticed unusual problems with my work. I arrived at the workshop one morning to find that wooden pieces I had carefully measured and cut the previous day no longer fit their intended positions. Joints that had been perfectly aligned were now off by several millimeters, and measurements I had marked with pencil had somehow changed overnight. Initially, I assumed I had made errors in my calculations or cutting. Apprentice work requires extreme precision, and small mistakes are common during the learning process. I remeasured everything and started over, being extra careful with my calculations. But the next morning brought the same problem. Pieces that had fit perfectly when I left work were now misaligned, and new pencil marks had appeared on my lumber, showing different measurements than what I had marked. More disturbing, my tools had been rearranged overnight. Chisels were placed in different positions, planes were adjusted to different cutting depths, and my measuring squares were set to angles I hadn't used. Everything was still organized and clean, but repositioned as if someone else had been using my workspace. When I mentioned the problems to Yamamoto-san, he examined my work carefully and found nothing wrong with my technique or measurements. "Your joints are cut correctly," he said, running his hands over the wooden pieces. "But something is interfering with the work after you complete it." He suggested that I start taking photographs of my progress each evening, documenting the exact positions of tools and the state of workpieces before leaving the workshop. The photographic evidence was undeniable. Between my evening departure and morning arrival, significant changes occurred to my workspace. Tools moved to different positions, wood pieces were repositioned, and new cut marks appeared on lumber, as if someone had continued working through the night. Most unsettling, the overnight modifications weren't random or destructive, they were improvements. Joints that had been adequate were refined to perfection, measurements that had been correct were adjusted to even greater precision, and decorative elements were enhanced with details I wouldn't have thought to include. Someone with masterful carpentry skills was continuing my work after hours, but their standards were so exacting that my apprentice-level craftsmanship apparently didn't meet their requirements. After 2 weeks of nightly interference, I decided to remain in the workshop overnight to discover who was modifying my work. I hid among stacked lumber near the back of the workshop at closing time, positioned where I could observe the entire workspace without being easily seen. The shrine grounds were quiet after visitor hours ended, with only security lights providing illumination through the workshop windows. At 2:37 a.m., I witnessed something that challenged my understanding of reality. An elderly man in traditional carpenter's clothing appeared in the workshop, moving with the confident familiarity of someone who had worked in that space for years. He examined my day's work with critical attention, running his hands over joints and checking measurements with tools that appeared more worn and seasoned than mine. His movements were precise and economical, demonstrating the kind of craftsmanship expertise that comes from decades of experience. But as I watched more carefully, I realized his form was translucent, and his feet didn't quite touch the wooden floor. The ghostly carpenter began modifying my work with supernatural skill, using tools that seemed to materialize in his hands as needed. He refined joints to impossibly tight tolerances, added decorative details with masterful precision, and corrected angles with the kind of perfectionism that bordered on obsession. As he worked, he muttered to himself in old-fashioned Japanese, expressing dissatisfaction with construction standards and lamenting the decline of traditional craftsmanship. His criticisms weren't directed at me personally, but at the general state of modern carpentry compared to the standards he had maintained during his lifetime. The ghostly work session continued for nearly 3 hours, with the spirit refining every aspect of my previous day's efforts until they met his exacting standards. When he finished, he arranged the tools in precise positions and faded away like morning mist. I remained hidden until dawn, then approached my workstation with awe and trepidation. Every piece had been improved beyond my current skill level. With joints so perfectly fitted, they seemed to have grown together naturally. That morning, I shared my supernatural encounter with Yamamoto-san, describing the ghostly carpenter and his nocturnal improvements to my work. "That explains the quality improvements we've been seeing in your pieces," Yamamoto-san said thoughtfully. "Someone with master-level skills has been completing your apprentice work. But why? What does he want? Let me research the history of this site. If a master craftsman's spirit is bound to this location, there must be a reason related to his original work here." Yamamoto-san spent the afternoon consulting shrine records and local historical documents. What he discovered provided disturbing context for my supernatural encounters. The workshop area where we worked had previously housed a traditional carpentry business operated by Takeshi Kojima, a master craftsman renowned for his work on religious buildings throughout Tokyo. In 1953, Takeshi-san had been commissioned to create elaborate wooden decorations for the shrine's main hall, a project representing the pinnacle of his career. But 3 days before the project's completion, an electrical fire started in his workshop during a late-night work session. Takeshi-san died trying to save his nearly finished masterwork, overcome by smoke while attempting to rescue carved panels that represented years of meticulous craftsmanship. The fire destroyed both his workshop and the sacred decorations he had been creating, leaving his final project incomplete and his reputation unfulfilled. His spirit is bound to this location by his unfinished masterwork, Yamamoto-san explained. Traditional craftsmen who die with important work incomplete often remain attached to the place where they were trying to complete their final projects. But why is he interfering with my work instead of finishing his own project? Perhaps he sees your apprentice work as continuation of the craftsmanship tradition he represents. He's trying to teach you the standards required for sacred architectural work. Yamamoto-san suggested that we research Takeshi-san's original design plans to understand what project he had been trying to complete when the fire killed him. The shrine's archives contain detailed drawings and specifications for the decorative panels Takeshi-san had been creating, intricate wooden carvings depicting traditional motifs related to honoring Japan's war dead. The designs showed masterful complexity that would challenge even experienced craftsmen. If we could complete his original project, Yamamoto-san proposed, his spirit might find the peace that has eluded him for over 70 years. The shrine's administration agreed to commission us to create the decorative panels according to Takeshi-san's original specifications, understanding that both the historical significance and supernatural circumstances warranted special consideration. Working on Takeshi-san's designs was the most challenging project of my apprenticeship. The level of detail and precision required pushed my skills beyond their current limits, but each night, the ghostly master continued his teaching through direct modification of my efforts. Gradually, I began to understand his standards and techniques. My daytime work improved as I internalized his approach to traditional joinery and decorative carving. The nightly corrections became less extensive as my craftsmanship met more of his exacting requirements. The collaboration between living apprentice and ghostly master created wooden panels of extraordinary beauty and precision. Each piece demonstrated craftsmanship that honored both traditional techniques and the spiritual significance of their intended installation. When we completed the final panel according to Takeshi-san's original designs, the nocturnal workshop visits stopped abruptly. The ghostly carpenter appeared once more, examining the finished work with obvious satisfaction before bowing formally toward the completed panels and fading away permanently. The decorative panels were installed in the shrine's main hall during a ceremony that honored both Takeshi-san's original vision and the traditional craftsmanship that had brought his 70-year-old designs to completion. 6 months have passed since we completed Takeshi-san's unfinished masterwork. The supernatural workshop interference has ended entirely, but my carpentry skills have been permanently enhanced by the ghostly master's intensive nighttime teaching. Working under Yamamoto-san has gained new meaning as I understand the spiritual dimensions of traditional craftsmanship. Creating wooden structures for sacred sites involves responsibility for maintaining standards that honor both the craftsmen who develop these techniques and the spiritual purposes the buildings serve. The experience taught me that some forms of dedication transcend death, and that master craftsmen's commitment to excellence can continue beyond their physical lifespans when circumstances leave their final work incomplete. My apprenticeship has become more than learning carpentry techniques. It's carrying forward traditions that connect modern construction work to generations of craftsmen whose spiritual dedication to their craft created the architectural heritage that defines Japanese religious sites. Sometimes the most meaningful education comes from teachers whose devotion to excellence continues even after death, and whose standards challenge living students to achieve levels of craftsmanship they never thought possible. The Temple Bell Ringer's Duty. My name is Ito Kazuko, and I'm 74 years old. What I'm about to tell you began in the autumn of 2024, when I volunteered to take over the evening bell ringing duties at Jodoji, the small Buddhist temple in our neighborhood in Sumida Ward. I'd lived in the same apartment building for 37 years, watching the neighborhood change as Tokyo expanded and modernized around us. When I retired from my job at the postal office, I found myself with time and a desire to contribute to the community that had been my home for so long. Jodoji Temple sits at the corner of our residential block, a modest wooden structure that has served local families for over a century. The temple isn't large or famous, but it provides an anchor of tradition in a neighborhood where old shops and houses are constantly being replaced by modern apartment buildings. The current head priest, Yamada-san, is a gentleman in his 60s who inherited the temple from his father. With a small congregation and limited resources, he relies on community volunteers to help maintain temple operations and traditional practices. When Yamada-san mentioned during a neighborhood association meeting that he needed someone to ring the evening bell, I offered my services. The daily evening bell is an important Buddhist tradition that calls the community to evening prayers and marks the transition from day to night. The bell must be rung every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Yamada-san explained, as he showed me the bell tower beside the main temple building. This has been done without fail for over 80 years, through war, earthquakes, and all the changes our neighborhood has seen. The temple bell is a beautiful bronze instrument, darkened with age and inscribed with Buddhist prayers. It hangs in a wooden tower accessed by a narrow stairway and is rung using a suspended wooden beam that strikes the bell's surface. The technique requires both timing and respect. The bell must be struck with steady, measured beats that resonate clearly across the neighborhood, calling people to pause their daily activities and remember the spiritual dimensions of their lives. I established a routine of arriving at the temple at 5:45 p.m. each day, climbing the bell tower stairs, and ringing the evening call at exactly 6 o'clock. The work was simple but meaningful, connecting me to generations of Buddhist practice and community service. For the first month, everything proceeded normally. I enjoyed the meditative quality of the bell ringing and the way the resonant tones spread through our neighborhood, calling residents to a moment of evening reflection. But in late October, I began noticing something unusual. When I struck the temple bell, creating its deep, resonant tone that echoed across the residential streets, I began hearing what sounded like a second bell answering from somewhere in the distance. The response came from the direction of the old part of the neighborhood, several blocks away where older buildings had been demolished for redevelopment. At first, I assumed the sound was an echo, or perhaps another temple conducting similar evening practices. Tokyo has hundreds of small Buddhist temples, and coordinated bell ringing isn't uncommon during certain religious observances. But as I paid closer attention over several weeks, I realized the responding bell had a different tone and rhythm than mine. Where Jodo G's bell produced deep, measured resonance, the distant bell created higher, more urgent sounds that seemed to carry a sense of longing or desperation. The pattern was always the same. I would complete the traditional evening bell sequence, 7 slow, deliberate strikes, and within moments, the distant bell would respond with its own series of strikes, as if acknowledging or answering my call. When I mentioned this to Yamada-san, his expression grew thoughtful. "From which direction does the answering bell seem to come?" he asked. "From the west, toward the area where they demolished the old buildings for the new shopping complex." Yamada-san was quiet for a moment. "Let me ask some of the elder parishioners about this. They might remember things about our neighborhood's history that could explain what you're hearing." The following week, Yamada-san introduced me to Tanaka-san, an 86-year-old woman who had lived in the neighborhood since childhood and remembered our area before most of the modern development. "Ah, you're hearing Matsuda-san's bell," she said when Yamada-san described my experience. I wondered if he would respond when someone started ringing the evening call again. "Who is Matsuda-san?" I asked. "He was the bell ringer at Kofukuji Temple, which used to stand where that shopping complex is now. For over 40 years, he rang the evening bell at the same time as all the other neighborhood temples." Tanaka-san explained that Kofukuji had been a small temple similar to Jodoji, serving local families with daily prayers and community ceremonies. Matsuda-san had been a devoted volunteer who took his bell-ringing duties very seriously, never missing a single evening in 4 decades of service. "What happened to him?" Yamada-san asked. "He died during the earthquake of 1995. Small earthquake by Tokyo standards, but it hit right during evening bell time. The temple bell tower shook, and Matsuda-san was struck by the bell as he was ringing it. Killed instantly." I felt a chill run through me. "And the temple?" "Demolished about 20 years ago, when the land was sold for commercial development. The congregation had grown too small to maintain the building, and the priest family couldn't afford the property taxes." Tanaka-san's story provided disturbing context for the responding bell I'd been hearing. If Matsuda-san had died while performing his bell-ringing duties, his spirit might still be bound to that daily practice, continuing to respond to evening calls, even though his temple no longer existed. "Has anyone else heard this responding bell?" I asked. "Not for years," Tanaka-san replied. "The last bell ringer at Jodoji died about 5 years ago, and there was a gap when no one was ringing the evening call regularly. But Matsuda-san always responded when someone rang at the proper time. That evening, I approached my bell-ringing duties with new awareness of their supernatural dimensions. When I struck the temple bell at 6 o'clock, I listened carefully for the distant response. It came exactly as it had for weeks, a series of higher-pitched bell strikes from the direction of the demolished temple site, carrying across the neighborhood like an echo from the past. But this time, I thought I could detect something beyond mere sound in the distant ringing. There was a quality of dedication and persistence that suggested someone performing a sacred duty with the same devotion he'd maintained for decades, despite the fact that his temple and physical existence had both been destroyed. I began researching the history of Kofukuji Temple and found records that confirmed Tanaka-san's account. The temple had indeed been demolished in 2004, and Matsuda-san had died during bell-ringing duties in 1995. More significantly, I found old neighborhood association records that showed both temples had coordinated their evening bells as part of a network of Buddhist temples that rang simultaneously at 6 p.m., creating a community-wide call to evening prayer. Matsuda-san's spirit was apparently still participating in this coordinated practice, responding to my bell as he had for 40 years when his temple still stood and he was still alive. The realization filled me with both awe and responsibility. My volunteer bell-ringing duties had become more than community service. They were maintaining a spiritual connection with a devoted practitioner whose death hadn't interrupted his commitment to evening prayers. I decided to research traditional Buddhist approaches to such situations, consulting with other temples and reading about spiritual practices related to honoring devoted practitioners who died in service to their religious communities. What I learned suggested that Matsuda-san's continued bell ringing represented a form of posthumous devotion that should be honored rather than feared or banished. His spirit's persistence in maintaining evening prayers demonstrated the kind of spiritual dedication that Buddhist tradition considers admirable. Rather than seeking to eliminate the supernatural response, I began incorporating formal acknowledgement of Matsuda-san's continued service into my own evening practice. After ringing Jodo-ji's bell and hearing the distant response, I would bow toward the direction of the former temple site and silently express gratitude for his ongoing participation in our community's evening prayers. This approach seemed to bring greater peace to both the supernatural response and my own understanding of the bell-ringing duties. The distant bell continued to answer mine, but the tone seemed less urgent and more harmonious, as if Matsuda-san's spirit appreciated being acknowledged rather than feared. 6 months have passed since I learned about Matsuda-san's story. I continue ringing the evening bell at Jodo-ji, and he continues responding from the site of his demolished temple. We've established a spiritual partnership that spans the boundary between life and death, maintaining a tradition of community evening prayers that has persisted despite physical destruction and the passage of decades. Other neighbors have begun noticing the paired bell calls, and several elderly residents have shared memories of when multiple temples in our area coordinated their evening practices. The supernatural continuation of this tradition has become a source of community connection to our neighborhood's spiritual history. Yamada-san has incorporated Matsuda-san's story into temple services, honoring him as an example of devotion that transcends death. During special ceremonies, we acknowledge the spiritual presence that continues to participate in our evening prayers from beyond the demolished temple grounds. My volunteer work has gained dimensions I never anticipated when I first offered to help with temple duties. Ringing the evening bell has become a daily reminder that spiritual dedication can persist beyond physical death, and that some forms of community service create connections that survive even the destruction of the places where they were originally performed. Working with Matsuda-san's spirit has taught me that traditional religious practices can accommodate supernatural elements when they arise from genuine devotion rather than malevolent intent. His continued bell ringing represents the kind of spiritual persistence that Buddhist teaching considers worthy of respect and support. The evening bell calls still resonate across our changing neighborhood each day at 6 o'clock, but now they carry both the voice of our surviving temple and the echo of one that was demolished 20 years ago. Together, they maintain a tradition that connects our modern community to generations of Buddhist practice and the devotion of practitioners who refuse to let death interrupt their service to the spiritual life of our neighborhood. The Festival Mask Makers Workshop. My name is Ayami Sato, and I'm a third-year fine arts student at Tama Art University. What I'm about to tell you happened during the winter of 2024, when I was 21 years old and desperately needed affordable studio space to complete my graduation portfolio. Finding workspace in Tokyo as an art student is nearly impossible. University studios are overcrowded and have limited hours, while commercial art spaces rent for more than most students can afford. When I saw a listing for a small studio apartment in Asakusa for only 60,000 yen per month, half the typical rate for that area, I jumped at the opportunity despite the suspiciously low price. The space was on the second floor of an older building near Sensoji Temple, in a neighborhood known for traditional crafts and cultural preservation. The studio was compact but had good northern light through large windows, wooden floors that could handle paint spills, and enough room for an easel, storage, and basic living necessities. The landlord, Tanaka-san, was an elderly man who seemed eager to rent the space quickly. During our brief meeting, he mentioned that the apartment had been vacant for several months and needed someone who would respect the artistic heritage of the space. The previous long-term tenant was a craftsman who specialized in traditional work, he explained. He used this space for over 30 years. I hope you'll honor the creative spirit he brought to this room. I assumed he was referring to some respected local artisan, and I was happy to work in a space with such artistic history. The rent was affordable, the location was convenient for accessing traditional art supply shops in Asakusa, and the atmosphere felt conducive to serious creative work. I moved in immediately and set up my studio equipment, canvases, paints, brushes, and reference materials for my final project series exploring contemporary interpretations of traditional Japanese folklore. My thesis work focused on reimagining classical demons and spirits through modern artistic techniques. For the first 2 weeks, everything proceeded normally. I established a routine of painting during the day and cleaning up my workspace each evening before sleep. The studio felt comfortable and inspiring, with the kind of creative energy that comes from spaces where serious artistic work has taken place. But in early December, I began noticing strange occurrences with my art supplies. I would carefully arrange my brushes, paints, and tools before leaving the studio each evening, organizing everything according to my established system. But when I returned the next morning, I'd find my supplies rearranged in patterns that resembled traditional Japanese mask designs. Paint tubes would be positioned to outline the shape of demon faces, brushes arranged to suggest flowing hair or decorative elements, and palette knives placed to create the angular features characteristic of festival masks. The arrangements were too precise and artistic to be coincidental or the result of settling or movement. Initially, I thought I might be unconsciously creating these patterns myself during late-night work sessions when I was tired. Art students often work in semi-automatic states, and it seemed possible that I was arranging supplies without conscious awareness. But as the phenomenon continued and became more elaborate, I realized the arrangements were appearing overnight while I slept, and they demonstrated knowledge of traditional mask-making techniques that I hadn't studied in detail. More disturbing, my paintings began changing without my conscious participation. I would work on canvas depicting contemporary scenes, urban landscapes, modern figures, abstract compositions, but when I returned to the studio each morning, I'd find that additional paint had been added overnight. The modifications always involved facial features, transforming human expressions into the grotesque, exaggerated faces of classical Japanese demons. Peaceful facial expressions became snarling grimaces with protruding fangs. Gentle eyes turned into wild, bulging stares with supernatural intensity. Calm mouths transformed into gaping maws with visible tongues and threatening expressions. The overnight additions were skillfully applied, showing technical mastery that exceeded my current abilities. The brushwork demonstrated understanding of traditional Japanese artistic techniques, particularly the methods used to create festival masks and theatrical makeup for classical performances. Most unsettling, the demon faces being added to my work were accurate representations of specific oni types from traditional Japanese folklore, aka oni with red skin and fierce expressions, Ao oni with blue complexion and wild hair, and various other demons that appeared in festival performances and religious ceremonies. I began researching the building's history to understand what might be causing these supernatural artistic collaborations. At the local ward office, I found records showing that the space had indeed been occupied by a traditional craftsman named Matsuda Jiro, who had operated a mask-making workshop from 1972 until his death in 2023. Matsuda-san had been a respected artisan specializing in creating masks for shrine festivals, theatrical performances, and traditional ceremonies throughout the Tokyo region. His work was known for its technical excellence and authentic representation of classical demon and spirit figures. But the circumstances of his death were disturbing. According to the records, he had died alone in the workshop while working on a commissioned set of Oni masks for a major shrine festival. He was found 3 days later by concerned neighbors, apparently having suffered a heart attack while painting intricate details on a particularly fierce demon mask. The incomplete mask set was discovered around his body, with several Oni faces partially finished, and one that appeared to be completed despite his death occurring during the painting process. This information provided disturbing context for the supernatural artistic activity I was experiencing. If Matsuda-san had died while working on Oni masks, his spirit might still be bound to the workshop space, compelled to complete the artistic projects that death had interrupted. I decided to research traditional beliefs about craftsmen who died during creative work, consulting books on Japanese folklore and spiritual practices related to artistic dedication. What I learned suggested that master craftsmen who die while engaged in their life's work sometimes remain spiritually attached to their workspace, continuing their artistic practice through supernatural means. This was particularly common when the uncompleted work involved spiritual or religious subjects, like festival masks, that were intended to represent powerful supernatural entities. The Oni masks Matsuda-san had been creating when he died weren't just artistic decorations, they were representations of powerful spiritual forces used in religious ceremonies and festivals that served to protect communities from evil influences. His spirit might be compelled to complete these protective masks, using my artistic skills and materials to finish the supernatural commissions that death had left incomplete. Understanding the situation didn't make it less unsettling. Each morning brought new evidence of overnight artistic collaboration with a dead master craftsman whose standards and techniques far exceeded my own abilities. My thesis work was being transformed into something I hadn't intended to create, a series of traditional demon portraits that demonstrated skills I didn't possess and knowledge I hadn't acquired through my formal art. Education. The supernatural mentorship was technically impressive, but artistically disturbing. I was losing control over my own creative work, becoming a vessel for someone else's artistic vision that focused exclusively on frightening supernatural subjects. After a month of nocturnal artistic collaboration, I decided to seek help from Yamada-san, the head priest at Sensoji Temple, hoping he might understand the spiritual dimensions of my situation. Matsuda-san was indeed a devoted craftsman, Yamada-san confirmed when I described my experiences. His masks were used in festivals throughout this district for over 40 years. His death while working on Oni representations was significant. How can I help him complete his work so he can rest? The challenge is that Oni masks must be created with specific spiritual protections and blessings. Simply finishing the physical craftsmanship isn't sufficient. The masks must be properly consecrated for use in religious ceremonies. Yamada-san explained that Matsuda-san's spirit was likely trying to complete not just the artistic aspects of his final commission, but the spiritual preparation required for masks that would represent powerful supernatural entities. If you're willing to help him finish his work properly, we can arrange for the completed masks to be blessed and used in appropriate ceremonies. This might give his spirit the completion it seeks. Working with Yamada-san's guidance, I began consciously collaborating with Matsuda-san's spirit, rather than resisting the supernatural artistic influence. Each evening, I would prepare canvases and materials specifically for traditional mask painting, then allow the overnight supernatural work to proceed. Each morning, I would find beautifully crafted Oni faces that demonstrated master-level technique and authentic traditional styling. The conscious collaboration produced remarkable results. Within 2 weeks, we had completed a set of 7 traditional demon masks representing different types of Oni used in festival ceremonies. Yamada-san examined the finished work with obvious admiration. These are exceptional examples of traditional craftsmanship. Matsuda-san's skills haven't diminished despite his death. The completed masks were formally blessed during a ceremony at Sensoji Temple and donated for use in the next spring's festival celebrations. As part of the blessing ritual, Yamada-san offered prayers for Matsuda-san's peaceful rest and gratitude for his continued dedication to traditional arts. After the blessing ceremony, the supernatural artistic activity in my studio stopped completely. My art supplies remained where I placed them each evening, and my paintings stayed unchanged overnight. 3 months have passed since we completed Matsuda-san's final commission. My studio space has returned to normal artistic use. But the experience fundamentally changed my understanding of creative work and spiritual dedication. My thesis project evolved to incorporate the traditional mask-making techniques I learned through supernatural mentorship, creating a body of work that bridges contemporary art practice with classical Japanese craftsmanship traditions. The collaboration taught me that artistic dedication can transcend death when it involves creating objects that serve spiritual and community purposes beyond mere personal expression. Matsuda-san's commitment to his craft was so profound that not even death could interrupt his responsibility to complete work intended for religious ceremonies. Working in his former studio has given my own artistic practice deeper connection to traditional Japanese culture and the spiritual dimensions of creating objects intended to represent powerful supernatural forces. The experience demonstrated that some creative spaces hold the spiritual energy of previous artists whose dedication to their craft created lasting connections between the workspace and their artistic vision. Sometimes the most meaningful artistic education comes from mentorship that transcends the normal boundaries between teacher and student, living and dead.